Guys, it's finally October. Spooky season has arrived. I honestly kind of give myself the ick every time I refer to it as spooky season, but I physically cannot stop myself anymore. But October is finally here. We are now in the month of Halloween, which is my favourite time of year if it wasn't... I mean, it is pretty obvious to be fair. You'll have to excuse the absolute state of my face. For the entire month of October, I am doing a look every single day with multiple videos for it. I've been working on this content for the last 2 months already. So my skin has been going through it a little bit. But I'm super excited to start sharing all of the content that I have made. It will be going on like all platforms. I just realised I got too excited and launched in without doing all my usual intro stuff. Hi, welcome to my channel. Or welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Hazel Jane, and today we have a slightly different video, but not. For the entirety of October, I will be releasing a new episode of Monsters, Myths and Makeup every week, which, if you didn't know, is a series that I have where we get to delve into the weird and wonderful world of monsters and myths whilst I attempt to bring the stories to life through a makeup look inspired by the creatures behind the legends. If you like mythology and or makeup, I would recommend hitting subscribe because that basically covers a lot of what I do. If you're already subscribed, thank you very much. I love you and appreciate you. Please feel free to hit like if you enjoy the video. Today's episode is going to be a lovely little compilation of all the Halloween content that I did last year for Monsters, Myths and Makeup. Obviously, if you were here last year, you will have probably seen these, but I figured it would be a fun way to just sort of get into the spirit of Halloween before I then start releasing all the new episodes. So make sure you are subscribed with notifications on so that you don't miss any of the new uploads, as well as all the short content and other looks that I will be posting. But other than that, you know the drill by now. Grab a Red Bull, grab a Monster, grab a seat, and let's go. Whilst I was planning out the looks that I was going to be doing for the 31 days, it got me to thinking of sort of Halloween-related myths and stories and legends and things that I could look into to tie it in with this series, which led me to think of Halloween itself. So I ended up doing a little bit of research, and there is a lot of history associated with the history of Halloween. There's a lot of superstition around Halloween and certain Halloween traditions, as well as various folklore and one or two little legends. So I thought it would be a really fun way to kick off the Halloween season by looking into Halloween. I'm going to be changing my contact lenses out at the end, but let me just go do a quick change and then we will get stuck into where the hell Halloween came from. So Halloween, especially in places like America and to an extent the UK, is kind of a big deal. I'm like 98% sure it counts as like $1 billion industry now. It's crazy. And obviously alongside Halloween there are various traditions and practices, games that are played, things like that. Despite America being probably one of the biggest sort of celebrators of this holiday, and I mean, like, you guys go all out. A lot of the traditions that are associated with Halloween were actually brought over by Scottish and Irish immigrants during the 19th century. And then once they came over to America, a lot of these practices were adopted and adapted slightly, and sort of they started spreading to other countries around the 20th century. Now, whilst we generally associate Halloween with costumes, decorations, trick-or-treatings, horror, sort of in general, it is part of a Western Christian holiday known as All Hallowtide, which runs over 3 days. So you have Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, which is on October 31st. Then you have All Saints Day, or All Hallows Day, or Hallowmas, which is on November 1st. And then you have November 2nd, which is All Souls Day. Now, All Hallowtide is a sort of festival in which to remember and honour the dead. This included like martyrs and saints and just the souls of the faithful departed. The word All Hallowtide was first used all the way back in 1471, and it's comprised of 3 separate words, all from Old English. So you have the word hallow, which means holy. You then have the word tide, meaning time or season, and all, meaning all. Now, hallow and saint are actually synonyms for each other, which is why it's sometimes referred to as All Saints Day, other times All Hallows Day, And it's why when people say like hallowed ground, it's like holy ground. And obviously Halloween or All Hallows Eve is the evening before. Now within Christianity, honouring the dead was particularly important, especially when it came to martyrs. And originally in like the early church, feast days were held on an individual basis and sort of in local instances for each martyr. However, during the persecution of Christians during the Roman Empire, basically they ran out of days. They ended up with more martyrs than there were days in the year, so they decided to hold an individual day to honour all of them. So it originally started out as All Hallows Day or All Saints Day, and then the vigil of All Hallows Eve from the night before. The third day was then added as All Saints Day, just to honour the souls of the dead in general. First side note of the video, because I looked it up, a vigil is described as a period of purposeful sleeplessness and an occasion of devotional watching, and it's obviously therefore generally used to mean like evening, because obviously I've heard of like candlelit vigils before, and I know they're generally held in the evening or at night. I just never knew that it was like you deliberately stay up to have this vigil this evening. Now, the origins of All Hallowtide itself are thought to actually have originated as a ritualistic remembrance of the Great Flood, Noah's Ark, that kind of thing. But the idea was that the first night was in remembrance of the wickedness of the world before the flood. The second night celebrated those who were saved by it and survived the flood. And then the third night was to celebrate those who would then go on to repopulate the earth. That in particular is not like a confirmed thing, it's more just a theory, but I just found it interesting that even back then, the Halloween aspect of that trio was associated with like wickedness and sin, and then obviously the associations nowadays with like horror and things like that. It was an interesting parallel to me. Not that I'm saying horror movies and that are sinful, but you know what I mean. Now, the origins of All Hallows Eve in particular is a heavily debated topic, with some scholars maintaining that Christians came up with the idea themselves and completely independent of anyone else or any other cultures or religions. It's argued by a lot of people, and it's generally becoming more and more accepted that a lot of the practices and traditions associated with All Hallows Eve were absorbed by the Christian church from the Celtic practices associated with a festival known as, bear with me on this pronunciation, Samhain? Okay, my bad. I think it's pronounced Samhain. Please feel free to correct me on that pronunciation, because I am trying really hard to get it right. I believe it's pronounced Sound, but it's spelt like this. But it's believed that the church were attempting to sort of Christianize the celebration in order to ease the Celts' conversion to Christianity. Now, Samhain itself is fascinating. It was an ancient Celtic festival observed by pagans, held on November 1st, and it marked the end of autumn and the beginning of winter. It was the end of harvest. The festival is actually mentioned in some of the earliest examples of Irish literature dating back to the 9th century, and it is actually associated with a lot of very important events throughout Irish mythology in general. I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole looking into that, because there's so many Irish folklore stories that centre around this festival and this date, lots of traditions that happened. Now, the earliest records showed that this festival was marked by these like great big feasts and big gatherings of people, and it was known as a liminal or threshold festival, which is where the boundaries between this world and the other world were blurred. And obviously in Irish mythology, the other world is this place of like everlasting beauty and youth, and it's the domain of a lot of like gods and deity figures. During this festival, it's believed that the ancient burial mounds dotted throughout Ireland, I've been informed that it's pronounced she, not side or sids. She? The ancient burial mounds throughout Ireland were open because they were seen as like portals to the other world. Now, a lot of the actual details of this festival weren't recorded until a lot closer to the modern era. Said details included a lot of sort of general harvest time practices, things like cattle being brought in from the summertime pastures, certain livestock being slaughtered in preparation for the winter, things like that. But a lot of the practices recorded for this festival sound very, very familiar to what we often associate with Halloween nowadays, and it is often believed that this festival in particular is the origin for a lot of those behaviours, those traditions. Now, some of the practices that marked this festival that, as I said, can be seen quite heavily associated with Halloween in the modern age. Things like special bonfires being lit because it was believed that they had both protective and cleansing powers. And these protective powers were especially relevant because whilst it was believed the portals to the other world were open, it meant that making contact with spirits or fairies was a lot more likely to happen. Now, during the festival, these particular fairies and spirits, which a lot of scholars believed are like remnants of ancient pagan gods, these spirits and fairies were often appeased with offerings of food or drink in order to ensure that people lived and survived through the winter along with their livestock and things like that. It was also believed that on this particular night when these portals were open, the souls of family members or kin who had passed away would return to the home, so it became a customary tradition to set a place for them at the table. And this belief in particular is actually found in a very large number of different countries and different cultures, like all across the world. And it's believed that this aspect in particular has like super ancient origins. Now, divination was a huge part of this festival as well, and it presented itself in various different forms, but it was usually to try and gain insight into one's future, particularly in relation to like death and marriages and things like that. Among these sort of games and acts of divination, apples and hazelnuts were most commonly used. Within Celtic mythology, apples are very strongly associated with the other world and immortality, whereas hazelnuts are associated with divine wisdom. Now, speaking of apples, can you guess what one of the most common games of divination was? Well, I'm going to tell you anyway. It was apple bobbing. The belief was, when it came to sort of divination, that if you were able to grab an apple during apple bobbing, or I think it was also referred to as like dunking, but the belief was that if you were able to grab an apple, whoever it belonged to would be your future spouse. On a side note, before it was associated with Samhain, apple bobbing was adopted and kind of merged from Romans with Celtic celebrations. So it was when the Roman army merged their own celebrations with traditional Celtic festivals, and during an annual celebration, young unmarried people would try to bite into an apple floating on water or hanging from a string, and the first person who was able to successfully bite into it would be the next one who was allowed to marry. Even though the Romans got it from merging their own celebrations with Celtic festivals, it was later appropriated into Samhain, as apples were also a sign of like fertility and sort of abundance, hence the association with marriage and spousal and that side of things. It was also said that a maiden who placed the apple that she had bobbed under her pillow would then dream of her future sweetheart. In a similar vein to apple bobbing, but more in keeping with what I read as being like the Roman version of it, another game that was played involved hanging a small wooden rod from the ceiling with a lit candle on one end and an apple hanging off a bit of string on the other end. The rod was then spun round and everyone took turns trying to catch the apple with their teeth. The more I thought about that, I don't know logistically how that would work in terms of like whether the apple hung a lot lower than the candle or what, but I had this vision of someone trying to take a bite of the apple and then just getting a face full of candle. There was another practice that they did that I've also seen referred to as an apple wedding, and it's basically where you would take an apple and you would peel the skin off in just one long strand. You then toss the peel over your shoulder, either into a bucket of water or just on the floor. The peel would then form a letter which would reveal the initial of your future spouse. Because I remember seeing that in a really old episode of Charmed when I was a kid, and for some reason it stuck with me. Because I remember thinking at the time, like, unless your spouse's name begins with like a C or an O, I don't know how many other letters an apple peel is really gonna make. Another form of divination involved taking 2 hazelnuts and roasting them by an open flame. The idea being that one of the hazelnuts was named after the person who was doing the roasting, and the other hazelnut was named after the person that they desired. And the belief that followed that was that if the 2 hazelnuts like jumped apart from each other or like jumped away from the flames, it signified that it was a bad match. But if they just sat there roasting quietly, it signified that it was a good match. And that one in particular really reminded me of, like, do you remember those like playground games you used to play where it was like little fortune tellers? You'd have the paper thing where you'd do and it had like numbers, or it would reveal your fortune, that kind of thing. But it also really reminded me of like the earlier days of the internet where you'd get those like crush calculator things, where it's like you type in your name and you type in the name of your crush and like maybe a few other details, and then it would like calculate how compatible you were with each other and give you like a percentage. Like obviously that especially was all bogus, but it just really reminded me of that, like using these sort of divination senses to work out whether you should be with someone. So I found that quite fascinating. There was also a practice of hiding items in food, such as like cakes and things like that, and then it would be served out to people at random, and whatever item you found within your bit of food was tied into the prediction of your future. So for example, if you found a ring, it would signify marriage. If you found a coin, it signified wealth, that kind of thing. There was another example that I saw that it really caught my attention for being so unbelievably specific. Like the amount of steps that were involved in it was kind of insane. So it was basically a salty oatmeal bannock. I think it's pronounced bannock. It's like a type of flatbread was baked. Someone would then eat it in 3 bites, then go to bed in silence without having anything to drink, and this was said to result in a dream in which their future spouse would offer them a drink. Okay, I'd love to know who put all the steps together to form that one. I'm gonna be honest, that one feels a bit more like, you know, some of the remedies that people suggest when you have hiccups, like drinking from the wrong side of a cup or standing on your head for 10 seconds and things like that. There was a Calvin and Hobbes comic strip years ago where he was giving him all these suggestions of like how to get rid of hiccups, and then he generally said towards the end of it, it seems like a lot of those remedies were just thought of to entertain the other person. And it's like that particular practice of eating this really salty flatbread without a drink and then just going to bed, I don't know, it seems too specific. I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole with this because divination in itself is fascinating because there's a lot of blurred lines between, I think, sort of divination and almost superstition. There was other things like people would drop egg whites into water and the shapes that it made would predict the number of future children you would have. Young people would chase crows and like they would determine aspects of their future based on things like the number of birds that were there or what direction they flew in. And it reminded me of like the little rhyme that goes along with whenever you see a magpie. I remember my granddad teaching me that rhyme when I was a kid, and it stuck with me. I still say that rhyme to myself every time I see a magpie now. Now, going back to the liminal aspect of the sound festival, it was a kind of unwritten rule that people would generally take great care not to offend the spirits or fairies that had made their way through the boundaries between worlds. And generally speaking, people would try and sort of ward off anyone who was out to cause mischief. Whilst they had these like great gatherings and feasts and things like that, people would generally try and stay quite close to their home if they could. Or if they did have to walk out into the darkness, there was a practice of turning your clothes inside out or carrying iron and salt in your pockets to keep the spirits away. And obviously it's interesting because iron and salt are obviously very commonly associated with the paranormal, ghosts, spirits nowadays, that kind of thing. And it's a very ancient practice of those particular items being used to ward off paranormal evil spirits. Now, in Southern Ireland, it was a custom to weave a small cross together of like sticks and straw, and it was called a partial, but people would make them at the Sound Festival, and then you place them on doorways to ward off bad luck, evil spirits and witchcraft, sickness, that kind of thing. And then at the next Sound Festival you would replace it with a new one. Sound also had a tradition that was originally referred to as mumming or guising, in which people went door to door wearing costumes, reciting verses and songs in exchange for food. And it's believed that the costumes may have been a way of disguising yourself from the spirits and the fairies that were present. Now, the tradition of guising does actually come from Ireland and Scotland, and as I'm sure you can guess, it is generally believed to be the origin for what we now know as trick-or-treating. But guising specifically was the act of children going door to door in disguise, being given a gift of food or coin or apples and nuts for the Halloween party. In Ireland and Scotland as well, Halloween masks were referred to as false faces, and I believe in certain parts of Ireland and Scotland they are still referred to as false faces. Now, in Scotland, youths would go house to house, usually wearing like veils or face coverings, or in some instances they had used the ash from the bonfires to sort of blacken out their faces. And again, this was used as a protective measure against the spirits and fairies that were said to be roaming around. And these particular youths would often recite poetry or rhymes or verses, and they would often threaten to do mischief if they were not welcomed in or given gifts. Now, guising in Scotland has been recorded since like the 16th century, but it was originally generally only done during the new year. But in 1895, there was a record of guising at Halloween, which described masqueraders in disguise, carrying lanterns made of scooped out turnips, visiting homes to be rewarded with cakes and fruit and money. And in Ireland, with guising, children would often use the phrase, "help the Halloween party," when they knocked on the doors. There are some links and beliefs that guising itself originated from yet another tradition in which people impersonated the souls of the dead to accept and receive offerings on their behalf. And again, it's one of those instances where it was believed that impersonating these spirits and these souls offered protection from them. And as I said in the other case, by impersonating them, you were disguising yourself sort of amongst them so they wouldn't hurt you. Now, when it came to impersonating these spirits, it was a bit of a grey area that bordered the line between guising and playing pranks, because playing pranks at Samhain is recorded in the Scottish Highlands as far back as like 1736. It led to Samhain actually being nicknamed as Mischief Night, which is now its own whole separate thing. Mischief Night is considered on October 30th, so the night before Halloween, and in some areas it's actually referred to as Devil's Night. Now, I'd heard of Devil's Night before, I didn't know where it came from. Side note as well, Mischief Night is its whole own separate thing because it started out as like very, very harmless pranks. That's where things like toilet papering houses and throwing eggs and stuff like that, that's where all that kind of thing came from. But in certain areas, Mischief Night devolved into sort of petty crimes, and I think there was somewhere in like Detroit in particular that it had like really bad cases of arson associated with Devil's Night. So again, I think Devil's Night in particular is much more of an American thing. It's more Mischief Night over here. But again, it was a really fascinating little kind of tangent to go down. The idea of wearing costumes and playing pranks on Halloween spread to England in the 20th century. And as I said before, during the time of like mass transatlantic immigration from Ireland and Scotland over to America, costumes and pranks were a very strong tradition within Halloween and Samhain festivals. It then became very popularised in America, and obviously from there it's just exploded. Now, the earliest known recorded instance of guising at Halloween in North America was from 1911 from a newspaper in Canada, and the origin of the phrase trick or treat is believed to have come from central Canada before then spreading to the northern and western United States in sort of the 1930s. Now, there is some belief that trick or treating, especially in relation to sort of like candy and chocolates and sweets, that it was an adult intervention in order to discourage people from taking part in like mischief night vandalism, basically bribing them to behave. Whilst it's an amusing little side note, there aren't really that many reports or studies that kind of support that, apart from one area. So there is an area in Iowa that genuinely does have a record of trick-or-treating being used to deter crime. Because I originally read somewhere that, you know, the two were linked, and it was the people saying trick-or-treat, threatening to cause mischief if they weren't given the treat, and then people were like, okay, we'll give you the treat as long as you don't. Like, it was almost like a chicken and egg situation as to which one came first. But, as amusing as that would be, it's not proven to be the case. A lot of adults in America actually saw it more as like a form of extortion, and especially when it started spreading to other countries. So between the sort of like 30s and 50s, newspaper reportings of this trick-or-treating act, a lot of adults didn't really agree with it and they were confused by it. Some of them got a bit angry about it because, like I said, they saw it as a form of extortion. I remember when I was a kid, my first and only experience of trick-or-treating, there was one particular house we went to where the woman answered and just immediately said, I don't believe in trick-or-treating, it's an American thing, it shouldn't be here, and then just closed the door on us. That was fun for me. Now again, going back to the festival of Samhain and the tradition of guising, it was part of the tradition that the guisers or the pranksters would carry around turnips or manglewurzels, which are apparently a root vegetable in the same family as like beetroot. Never heard of them before, but they carried those around hollowed out, acting as lanterns. Usually they were carved with like really grotesque faces as well. The turnip heads were also placed on windowsills and in doorways, and it was said to represent the spirits and souls of these like supernatural beings. And once again, it was used as a way of warding off these evil spirits. So people would go around in these costumes with these lanterns so that as they're wandering around house to house, it would ward off the spirits that had entered through the open portals. Now, the use of turnips carved out and hollowed out with faces as a way of illuminating the path and as a way of warding off evil spirits comes from yet another tale of Irish folklore that is known as the legend of Stingy Jack. I'll be honest, I'd never heard of this legend before, but I absolutely love it. It is fascinating, it's kind of amusing, if I'm being completely honest. And again, it's just another example of particularly Irish folklore that has just had this really widespread impact and connotations with it. The Irish really did come up with a lot. Now, with regards to the actual legend itself, I found like two versions. One is the generally told one, and the other one was published in a journal in 1836. Now, this iteration, again, I'd never heard this one before, and it was only this one reference that I found to it, so I'll just briefly go over the story of that one first. So in that particular tale, the story is that this man named Jack helped an old man, and this old man was revealed to be an angel. The angel then grants Jack 3 wishes as a reward for helping him, but Jack decides to use these 3 wishes to punish anyone who sits in his chair, punish anyone who tries to take wood from his home, and anyone who tries to take his like cobbling tools, he fixed them to the ground so that they couldn't. Now, the angel is none too happy about this and very disappointed in Jack, bars him from entering heaven. Jack later on then manages to deflect messengers of Satan who are trying to like trick him, which means that he doesn't go to hell either, and he's condemned to roam the world in neither heaven or hell. Now, the more generally told legend, which is the one that I saw referenced to the most, and the more accepted version of the legend, I guess, is along a similar vein, but slightly less angel-y, more Satan-y. So the legend goes that centuries ago in Ireland, there was a man named Jack who was a drunkard and a manipulator and a liar, and he was just known for like deceiving people and playing tricks on them and just generally being not a very nice man. Satan himself overheard tales of Jack's like evil deeds and silvered tongue and went out himself to see if the rumours were true. So one night, which was believed to be Halloween, Jack is stumbling home, drunk obviously, and he comes across a body lying on the road. The body that he found was said to have this like really eerie demeanour and really creepy grimace, and the body was in fact Satan himself. So Jack realised it was Satan, realised that it was the end, Satan had come to collect his soul, take him to hell, so he made one last request and asked if the devil would allow him one last drink of ale before he was taken to hell. Now, the devil didn't particularly think anything of this, so he said, yep, sure, fine. So he took him to a local pub where he allowed him to have several more drinks. Jack then threw Satan a bit of a curveball that Satan was not expecting, because Jack asked Satan to pay the tab, stating that he didn't carry any money on him. As an example of just how good Jack was at manipulating people, he managed to convince the devil to turn himself into a silver coin that he could use to pay his tab to the bartender, and that Satan could just turn himself back when no one was looking. Now, Satan, being actually quite impressed by Jack's like nefarious tactics, agreed and turned himself into a coin. However, Jack did not use the coin to pay the tab. Jack instead put the coin in his pocket, but inside his pocket there was a crucifix, and the proximity of the crucifix meant that Satan could not return to his original form. Jack then coerced the devil into making a deal. Jack would release him and allow him to return to his original form if Satan granted him 10 more years before he came to collect his soul. Now, the devil, not really having any choice in the matter, agreed, so Jack released him and they parted ways. 10 years later, Jack came upon the devil again in the same setting, again Halloween night, and he seemed to accept that it was his time to go. But he again made one last request. This time he asked for an apple to fill his belly before he went to hell. Now, despite having been tricked by Jack in this exact same scenario 10 years prior, the devil, for whatever reason, agreed to his request. So Satan climbed a nearby tree to retrieve an apple for Jack, but while he was up in this tree, surprise surprise, Jack put a load of crucifixes around the base of the tree, trapping him there. Kind of like a cliched cat. Right, I'm actually very nearly finished with this makeup and also very nearly finished with the story. So let me just go and do all the last bits, fill in these bits and do the finishing touches, and then I'll be back and we can finish the tale of Stingy Jack and the story of Halloween in general. Hello, we're back. I don't know why it looks so much creepier with the lenses in. Just to very quickly explain the turtleneck and the reason I haven't painted my actual neck is I was kind of basing this look off this guy, this meme. I knew I wanted to do like a pumpkin-esque look for this video, but I kind of wasn't really sure how to, like, beyond just the pumpkin face, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with like the hair or the outfit, and then I remembered this meme exists, so I thought it would just be like a fun little thing. Anywho, finishing off quickly the legend of Stingy Jack. I've done that thing where I can't remember where I got to in the story. I think Satan was stuck in a tree. So yeah, Jack had convinced Satan to get him an apple. Satan had gone up into a tree. Jack had then placed crucifixes around the base of the tree, trapping Satan in the tree. And once again, Jack used this position of power that he was in to coerce the devil into yet another deal. In this instance, he said he would let Satan go if Satan agreed to never take his soul to hell. And Satan, again, not really having much of a choice in this scenario, agreed. So again, he let Satan go and carried on drinking and lying and being his mischievous little self. Now eventually Jack's lifestyle did catch up to him and he would die. And while his soul was preparing to go up and enter heaven, he reached the pearly gates, but he was denied entry. God told him that because of his drinking and his sinful lifestyle, he was not allowed into heaven. So Jack decided to go down to the gates of hell, figuring that, even hell would be better than wandering between the two for eternity, and he begged Satan to let his soul in. However, holding up his end of the bargain, Satan refused him entry because, hey, this was your bargain, you made me agree not to take your soul. So he was denied entry from both heaven and hell. Satan did give Jack an ember from the fires of hell to use as a way to illuminate his path, and Jack ended up placing this inside a hollowed out turnip, where he was then doomed to forever roam the earth between the worlds of heaven and hell. From this legend, it was believed that you could sometimes see the glow from his lantern, like off in the distance, especially on Halloween night, and the Irish began to refer to him as Jack of the Lantern, or Jack-o'-lantern for short. Now, interesting little side note to this, the sightings of his lantern are actually quite associated with something called will-o'-wisps, or will-o'-the-wisp. It's like this atmospheric, ghostly light apparition kind of thing, usually seen by travellers at night, especially over like bogs and swamps and marshes and stuff. Now, a lot of modern science has been able to attribute this sort of natural light phenomena to things like bioluminescence and the expulsion of gases that then sort of react with the light and create this illusion of like a coloured flame. But in folklore especially, they're said to mislead travellers by resembling a flickering lamp or lantern like in the distance. And these like will-o'-wisp things have been recorded in tales and legends from numerous different countries and cultures. It's one of those, it's like an aspect of folklore that spans a whole range of individual stories and tales. It's not one specific thing. Following on from this legend, people did start making their own versions of Jack's lantern by carving scary faces into turnips, where they would be placed on the windowsill or the doorframe of the house to frighten away Stingy Jack on Halloween night. Obviously being very heavily associated within Ireland, once this tradition travelled over to America, along with a lot of all the other Halloween traditions, it was found that pumpkins, which were native to America, so in abundance, were obviously a lot larger and a lot softer than turnips, and therefore significantly easier to carve, and as such, the tradition of carving pumpkins began. But so brings us to the end of the tale of Stingy Jack and the various legends of Halloween, or All Hallows Eve. Let me know what you guys think. Do you celebrate Halloween? What traditions and practices do you guys do? Let me know in the comments below, because I'd be really interested to know how different people interpret and celebrate Halloween, if you do celebrate it at all. Let me know what you think of the look as well. I am okay with it, I think. I think the vision is there. Kind of. Let me know what other creatures, stories, myths and legends you want me to cover. Keep an eye out for all the content that I've got coming out over the next month, because there's a lot. As I said though, there will be some special editions of my Monsters, Myths and Makeup series, so I'm really excited to share those with you. Otherwise, I hope you have a fabulous day. I am very appreciative to all of you, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye! So last episode we were looking at like Halloween traditions and the legend of Stingy Jack, who was, do you remember the guy who ended up getting Satan stuck in a tree? Now today we are still on theme with Halloween, because we are looking at the legend behind a game that is often played at Halloween. Now this game typically involves a bathroom mirror, a candle, and an apparition known as Bloody Mary. Have you ever played Bloody Mary? I don't think I have, but like either way, it's a very fascinating story. So let me shut my trap, go get prepped, and we can jump straight in. Now, who or what is Bloody Mary? So Bloody Mary is a classic scary game often played at Halloween or at sleepovers, and it's based on the legend of this ghost slash spirit slash phantom. The general idea with it is that this ghost spirit is conjured as part of what was originally an act of divination in order to glean some kind of insight into the future. Whilst the original iteration of the game was a bit more fortune teller-esque divination based, it has since developed into the much scarier version that we know and think of nowadays. The general idea of the game is that you repeat her name into a mirror in a darkened room, and it may cause her spirit, her apparition, to appear. Now, especially nowadays, the spirit is generally associated with being a malevolent one. Is that malevolent or malevolent? Are that right way around? Malevolent, I think. The bad one. But, as I said, the origins of this game, this ritual, it was a bit more in between. The spirit could appear in more of a friendly aspect. Now, the apparition of Bloody Mary was said to generally only appear when, like, a group was summoning her, which is one of the reasons why it is often played as a sort of party game with a group of people. Now, no one actually knows exactly when this legend started. People have looked into it for ages, but no one has been able to pinpoint an actual time. The only real time frame we have that it was during the 70s that historians actually started trying to trace back the origins of the game. So obviously we can assume that the game was around before the 70s. We just have no idea how much earlier it was. Now, the steps involved in this ritual have changed quite significantly over time. Historically, this divination ritual was quite different to what we think of when we hear Bloody Mary nowadays. It was said that historically, to perform this ritual, a young woman would walk up the stairs backwards in the dark, holding a candle and a handheld mirror. The idea being that they would look into the mirror and see one of two things. They would either see a vision of the face of their future husband, or they would see a skull, which was symbolic of the Grim Reaper, indicating that they would die before they had a chance to marry. Nowadays, the Bloody Mary ritual doesn't really have anything to do with sort of predicting the future, or especially not in relation to marriage and spouses. That's very much an old school divination thing. But nowadays, there are very specific steps that you have to follow for this ritual, but they all change depending on who you ask. But the generally accepted rules of the game involve standing in front of a bathroom mirror with the lights off whilst holding a candle and repeating the name Bloody Mary 3 times. Now, there's a lot of variation on these particular rules, from what you have to say to how many times you have to say it. I found some stories that said you had to say, "I believe in Bloody Mary," or even in some cases, "I killed your baby, Bloody Mary," which is just... ugh. And I saw a lot of variation on the number of times that you would say the name as well, and it varied anywhere from 3 to 13, and in some instances it was 100. During my research as well, I genuinely found a WikiHow article of how to summon Bloody Mary in 9 steps, with pictures, but this particular guide also involved like spinning around in a circle 3 times after you said her name. Other stories said you had to have water running from the sink while you were doing it. I think where it's developed into more of like a party game that you use to scare your friends, people have added their own kind of embellishments and flares to it as the years have gone on. Now, what was said to happen after this ritual, again, varies greatly depending on who you ask. But generally speaking, the idea was that once you finished this ritual summoning, the apparition of Bloody Mary may or may not appear. If you were successful and she did appear, you would have to endure her screaming at you, reaching out of the mirror to try and grab you and scratch your eyes out, attempting to strangle you, cursing you, stealing your soul, and in some cases, apparently even drinking your blood. Now, there is some law that states Mary can end up getting trapped in the mirror that you summon her in, and as a result, she will then haunt you forever. With the mirror as well, there are some iterations of it where apparently once you finish the ritual, the mirror itself will start like dripping with blood, as well as various other spooky occurrences like the participant's hair turning white, or in some cases the participant just disappearing without a trace altogether. The lore behind that in particular is that it was believed to be Mary trapping you inside the mirror with her. Now, if summoned correctly, the appearance of Mary can, once again, vary greatly depending on who you ask. She can appear as a corpse, as a ghost, or a witch, and she sometimes appears as, like I said, the friendlier type of ghost, but more often than not, she appears as like an evil or demonic spirit. She will often appear covered in blood in some capacity, hence the name Bloody Mary, and there are some instances where she's said to appear holding a baby who is very obviously deceased. Now, the origins of Bloody Mary and the belief that she is or isn't based on a real person is heavily debated. There are a number of historical figures that have been put forward over the years as possible origins for the Bloody Mary myth, the most common of which was Mary I of England, who was actually nicknamed Bloody Mary. So Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and she was born in 1516, and she went on to become the first ruling queen of England. England had had queens before this, but in the context of they were the king's wife, whereas Mary was the first ruling queen. She had a very tumultuous childhood, as I'm sure you can imagine, with Henry VIII as her father. And just on a surface level alone, her mother and father divorced, her father then remarried to Anne Boleyn, who he then had executed, and he declared Mary as an illegitimate child, and she spent most of her childhood confined to a place called Hatfield House. Then Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, encouraged the family to sort of reconcile. Henry did eventually then restore Mary to the line of succession for the throne in 1544 under encouragement from his last wife, Catherine Parr. One very quick little side note about Mary's childhood, because it's insane. So before Henry divorced her mother and basically disowned her, Henry actually arranged for Mary to be engaged when she was 2 years old. And it wasn't just like it was in preparation. Like, she was genuinely engaged when she was 2 years old to another 2-year-old. Like, they had a betrothal ceremony, and she was given a diamond ring and everything. The engagement was called off 3 years later, so when Mary was 5, but the year after that, she was set to marry her cousin, who was 22 years old. Like, I know we're talking about different times, and, you know, things were very different back then, especially with regards to royalty, but... Now, in relation to the Bloody Mary nickname, it's believed that there are 2 reasons why she's associated with the legend. The first being the actual reason she was given the nickname in the first place, which was to do with her persecution against the Protestants during her 5-year reign as monarch. Now, Mary was a devout Catholic, and she wanted to set out and try and restore Catholicism to England. And during the time of her reign, Mary would go on to have over 300 Protestants burned at the stake for refusing to convert to Catholicism in what became known as the Marian persecutions. Now, the act of burning someone at the stake was actually a very typical punishment for someone who was accused of heresy, which was considered at the time to be an infection of the body politic that had to be erased so as not to infect and poison society at large, whatever that means. So all over Europe, the punishment for heresy was not only death, but the complete and utter destruction of the heretic's corpse to prevent the use of any of their body parts for relics. Now, because Mary was succeeded by her Protestant half-sister, her legacy became one of this bloodthirsty tyrant, which earned her the nickname of Bloody Mary. A lot of scholars, however, have since debated how accurate this portrayal actually was, and whether or not it was blown out of proportion to try and paint Mary as this evil, villainous Catholic woman during a time ruled by Protestants. I don't quite know where I'm going with this eye look at the moment, and I'm making myself nervous. Okay, I just threw some glitter on there, and whilst it's now starting to border a bit into drag territory, I think it's saved it. Now, the other aspect of Mary that is attributed to the name Bloody Mary, and more so the legend of Bloody Mary, is for a much more literal reason, and that is that throughout her life, Mary really struggled with really heavy and very irregular menstrual cycles, and she struggled to conceive, and it's actually believed that she may have died from either uterine or ovarian cancer. Now, Mary was desperate to produce a Catholic heir to the throne, because otherwise it would go to her half-sister, who was a Protestant. But as I said, she really struggled to conceive. Now, there were 2 occasions on which Mary believed she was pregnant. And to be fair, she had all the symptoms for it. She experienced changes in her body, her menstrual cycle seemed to stop. For anyone looking in, and for Mary herself, it seemed true. It seemed that it had happened. But unfortunately, both pregnancies proved to be false. It's believed that Mary may have actually suffered from a very rare psychological condition where she so thoroughly believed that she was pregnant that her body basically started producing all the symptoms of pregnancy, like some weird kind of placebo effect almost. I can't remember the exact name of the condition, but it's basically where your mind tricks your body into behaving as if it's pregnant, which we all know the mind is very capable of some very powerful things, but to cause the physiological changes involved in pregnancy when there is no pregnancy purely because of your mindset is kind of terrifying, if I'm honest. I spent all that time using like white to brighten up my under eye, and then I've just covered it with shadow. Now, these phantom pregnancies, along with the details of Mary's struggles with her menstrual cycles, are often linked to a more literal interpretation of Bloody Mary, and it's also believed to be linked as to why, in some stories, she appears holding a deceased infant. Another historical figure that has been put forward as possibly being linked to the Bloody Mary thing is actually Elizabeth Bathory. Bathory? I still don't know how to pronounce it, I'm very sorry. Now, I mentioned her a little bit in my video looking into Dracula, because she was the Hungarian blood countess from like the 15th century who allegedly killed like 600 young women and girls and supposedly bathed in their blood to retain her youth. I'm not sure how you get from Elizabeth to Mary, but I mean, other than that, I'd say the story lines up. Now, another name that is very commonly associated with the legend of Bloody Mary is someone by the name of Mary Worth. Now, I actually found several stories about who Mary Worth was, but if I remember correctly, there's no recorded evidence of any of these stories being accurate from like census lists or various other records that were kept from the time, but these are the general stories that kind of circulate surrounding this name. So in one case, she was believed to be a woman who attacked and killed slaves who had been trying to escape from the American South using the Underground Railroad. Another was a woman who had taken her own life after her baby had died, and conversely, there was another tale of a woman who had taken her baby's life. And of course, there was the classic folklore origin of a woman who was accused of being a witch and subsequently burned at the stake. Now, the story of the supposed witch is generally a bit more widespread. The other stories that I found seemed to be more sort of like local stories. Again, it all depended on where you went, who you spoke to, and what story you listened to. But the witch Mary was said to live in a small cabin in a forest known for selling like tinctures and herbal remedies. So naturally, the people of the local village believed that she was a witch, and locals in general were just very, very wary of her for fear that she would curse them or their livestock. Now, eventually, young girls from the village started to go missing, and the villagers did suspect that it was Mary. Now, a few brave villagers went out to Mary to ask her about these missing girls, and Mary denied any knowledge of it, although it was noted that Mary's appearance had changed quite drastically, and she'd gone from this sort of elderly, haggard look to suddenly appearing much more youthful and very feminine. But whilst the villagers had their suspicions, they had no evidence. Then one night, the miller's daughter became captivated by a noise that only she could hear, and she started wandering out towards the forest. Now, her family had happened to be awake at the time, so they were able to follow her, and they roused a load of the other villagers to come with them and see what was going on. They were begging her to stop walking or try and communicate with them in any way, but it was like she was in a trance. She just didn't pay any attention to them. They then began to see like a small light coming from the forest, and as they got closer, they realised that they could see Mary standing in a clearing, holding a wand and pointing it towards the miller's house, and it was the wand that had this glow. Now, obviously, the villagers, who were already suspicious that Mary was a witch, very quickly captured her and set her to be burned at the stake. And then, as she was burning on the stake, she placed a curse on the village and the villagers, in that if any of them ever dared to utter her name into a mirror, her spirit would come back to take her revenge. I did find another origin for Bloody Mary that wasn't specifically linked to the Mary Worth name, but I found it a very interesting story anyway. Now, the tale of this one goes that there was a young girl named Mary who, in the 1800s, lived in a village that was plagued by this, like, mysterious illness, and it went around, and basically anyone who caught this illness was dead within a few days. Now, at that time, the general practice when it was believed that someone had died was that the town's physician would come out and, check for a pulse, or the other practice that they had was holding a mirror under their nose to see if condensation would form to indicate whether they were breathing or not. Now, obviously, in the 1800s, medicinal practices were not exactly the most effective or accurate, so there were many cases where people were thought to have died and then been buried but weren't actually dead. So it became a common practice when someone died that when they were buried, a small hole was made in the top of the coffin and a piece of string was fed through it. This string was then attached to a bell that was hung from like a stick or something, either next to the gravestone or near the house of the person who had died. The idea being that if this person wasn't dead, they would wake up in the coffin, they could pull the string, someone would hear it, and they would be able to stick them back up. Now, Mary did eventually contract this mysterious deadly illness, and it left her bedridden and just slowly dying. They prepared to bury her by placing her in this coffin in her grave, but her parents they wouldn't leave her side, and they stayed with her for days. Like, I think it was almost up to a week that they stayed with her, and it wasn't until their friends had come around and basically said, look, if she hasn't woken up by now, she's not going to wake up, at which point the parents kind of conceded and they went out with these friends. Now, whilst the parents were out, the neighbour came round and started filling in the grave. The string of the bell was all still attached and put in place, and once he had finished burying her, the neighbour paid his respects and then left. Whether he believed the parents had just gone back into the house or what, I don't know. Soon after this, however, Mary did in fact wake up, and once she'd woken up, she pulled on the string that was attached to a bell that no one could hear. Her parents were away, they had left the house, and her neighbour had gone back to his house, so he was too far away. So she pulled and pulled and pulled on this string until eventually she pulled the bell and the stick down, and that was it, she was stuck. At which point she began clawing and scratching at the inside of this coffin, just desperately trying to get out, to the point where her fingers bled, just ultimately until she died. Now, when Mary's parents returned, her father saw the bell that had fallen and realised what happened, so he called for his wife to come and help him dig up their daughter. But unfortunately, it was too late. When they opened the coffin, they found Mary frozen with this petrified look on her face, her hands bent into claws and covered in blood, which had then spilt onto the white dress that she had been buried in. Now, Mary was very obviously dead, but when the physician did his usual checks and held the mirror under her nose, condensation formed. From that, it's believed that her spirit then became attached to that mirror. And it's believed that this is why in some iterations of the ritual, when you summon her, she tries to claw at you, because she's still trying to claw her way out of the mirror and the coffin. I didn't find too many references to that particular story, but it was too fascinating to not include it. I mean, it's a harrowing, awful story, but very morbidly fascinating. Now, there is actually a modern legend in Japan known as, bear with me on the pronunciation, I am going to try, Hanako-san, which really strongly parallels the mythology of Bloody Mary and the ritualistic aspects of summoning them. Now, Hanako-san, which has an alternative name that translates to the Hanako of the toilet, is an urban legend about the spirit of a young girl who haunts the bathroom at a school. And this particular legend dates back to the 1950s. It's super, super popular within a lot of schools in Japan because it's one of those, you dare your classmates to go into the bathroom and try and summon the spirit. Now, like most myths, and especially urban legends, the details of the origins for this story vary very greatly depending on who you ask. Now, different stories of this legend include things like Hanako-san being a young girl from sort of World War II era who died in an air raid during a game of hide-and-seek where she'd hidden in the toilets. Another was that she was again a young girl who was murdered by one of her parents or a stranger, again in the bathroom of the toilets, and there are even more stories where it was a young girl who took her own life in the bathroom at school as a result of being bullied. Now, in order to summon this spirit, you are meant to go into the girls' bathroom, usually on the 3rd floor of a school, knock 3 times on the 3rd stall, and ask if Hanako-san is present. If she is, she will respond with some variation of, yes, I am. Now again, depending on what story you read, it's said that after you've done the little summoning ritual, you can see the appearance of a ghostly or bloody hand. It's then believed that either the hand or Hanako-san herself will drag you to hell by pulling you through the toilet. Another variation that I find very interesting is that you would be eaten by a 3-headed lizard who claimed that you were invading Hanako-san's privacy. Ghost stories like this and Bloody Mary can be found all over the world in a number of different countries and cultures, and they are often shared among children on the playground. Like I said, the Bloody Mary especially, it's a game that's played at sleepovers. You dare your friends to try it. It's a game that a lot of people know from their childhood, and over the years it has become sort of a challenge or a dare to get your friends to take part in this ritual. Okay, I'm really happy with how this is coming along so far. Watch me completely overdo it now and ruin it. But I'm almost at the end of this little story, and I very nearly finished this makeup, so let me just go and do the last final touches, and then we'll be back. It is so hard to see anything right now. You'll have to forgive me for the state of the wig. I am not a hair or wig stylist by any means, but I'm hoping you can kind of get the vibe that I was going for. Now, going back to the legend of Bloody Mary and the story and the experiences that people have, there is actually an aspect of psychology and science that can go some way to explaining a little bit behind some people's experiences when they do this ritual, because it is a known fact that staring at yourself in a mirror in a dimly lit room for a prolonged period of time can cause you to hallucinate, and basically your features can start to distort and look like they're melting. They'll move and rotate, and you start seeing things like strange faces behind you or animal faces as well. There was a psychology researcher who wrote about this phenomena, and he referred to it as the strange face illusion, and he believed it was a result of something called dissociative identity effect, which is basically where the brain's facial recognition system just completely misfires. Other possible explanations for it within the realm of science and psychology is that aspects of what people think they see in the mirror could be attributed to what's called the Troxler effect. It's an optical illusion that you will have probably seen at some point, but it affects your visual perception. And it's explained that when you fixate on a set point for even a short period of time, i.e. your own face in a mirror, an unchanging stimulus away from that focus point can look like it starts to fade and then disappear. The examples they usually use for this kind of thing, it's like there's a fixed point in the center and there's like loads of shapes around it, and it's this optical illusion that you stare at the center and suddenly all the shapes around the edge look like they're disappearing. So if you're standing in front of a mirror in a dimly lit room, staring at your own face for a prolonged period of time, the combination of the hallucinogenic effect of doing that in the first place, combined with things like Troxler's fading, you're gonna see all kinds of crap. I did see one very interesting interpretation of the legend and kind of like the symbolism of it, where it was linked to adolescence and puberty, especially for young girls. And when you look at the details of the ritual, it is often performed in a bathroom. It's to do with the sudden appearance of a woman covered in blood, and it's often played by young girls who are of the kind of age to start getting their menstrual cycle. So some people have interpreted it to be a kind of symbolic ritual or rite of passage to do with a young girl getting her period for the first time, which, like, I get it, and it's kind of a cool interpretation. I like that way of looking at it. I like symbolism in that respect. But generally speaking, obviously, Bloody Mary and the legend of her ghost or spirit is generally just considered to be a fun little game that you play with your friends to scare each other when you're having sleepovers, or something you do at Halloween. I saw lots of stories of people who reminisced about their older siblings, getting them to do it when they were a lot younger. There was one where they said their brother had told them they had to do it specifically at 3 o'clock in the morning. So she set an alarm to get up and go and do it. But obviously her brother had woken up with her when the alarm went. So when she went into the bathroom with the candle and did the ritual, he was outside the bathroom and slammed the door shut, which obviously scared the living bejesus out of her. So the Bloody Mary legend, whilst there is still quite a big, not stigma, there is still quite a big fear factor associated with the game. There are a lot of adults nowadays who, they heard about it when they were a kid, but to this day they will refuse to do it. And whether or not it's genuinely because they believe this ghost or spirit will come and haunt them, or whether it's just the connotations of the game and the kind of reputation that it has, it builds up this tension and this atmosphere if you try and do it. As far as I remember, I have never played it. I know some people who have said, nothing happened, but it was quite creepy at the time when they did it. I don't know what is going on with this wig. It's the Medusa problem all over again. I don't know if the hair's moved and looks worse because I can't see anything, but I'm hoping it hasn't. But so goes the legend of Bloody Mary. That was a fun one. I really enjoyed that. Let me know what you guys think. If you've ever played Bloody Mary, please tell me. I am dying to know people's experiences with it. Or if you know someone else who's played it, let me know in the comments down below, because I would love to hear your stories about it. What do you think of the origins itself? Like, who do you think it's based on, or do you think it is based on anyone? Or is it just a folklore story? Is it not necessarily based on any one person? Let me know what you think of the look as well. Other than the wig that I'm not entirely sure on, the look itself, I'm really happy with. I really enjoyed putting this together, and I feel like it's a nice mix of like kind of spooky but still kind of glam. I mean, if it wasn't immediately obvious, the idea is that this is the broken mirror and the blood from the bleeding Mary. Let me know what other monsters or myths or stories you want me to cover in the comments down below. Thank you very much for stopping by. I appreciate all of you. I hope you have a fabulous next week for October, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye. Last week we spoke about the Halloween game and the legend surrounding Bloody Mary. Today we're going to be looking at something that's not necessarily like Halloween specific, and it's more of a horror thing. Because as I was planning out some of the ideas that I had for the 31 looks of October, I realised I really wanted to do like the classic creepy haunted doll. And obviously the one that always comes to mind with that, especially for things like Halloween costumes, is Annabelle. I know Annabelle is based on a real doll, but I didn't know too much about said real doll. So inevitably I started doing a bit of research, fell down a rabbit hole, and now I have 9 pages worth of notes to talk about. So strap in. But yeah, we're going to be having a little look at kind of the legacies associated with classic dolls, where the concept kind of comes from, as well as a few real life cases of allegedly haunted dolls. So before I waffle on for too much longer, let me go get prepped and we can get started. Now, haunted, creepy looking dolls are a staple, a classic trope used within horror movies and the paranormal, usually along the lines of like demonic possessions or curses, spirits, that kind of thing. There are some very well-known examples of haunted dolls in like mainstream media that have really increased the popularity of the whole idea. And you're looking at things like Annabelle, but also things like Chucky, which I know they're kind of, the way they're presented is kind of two ends of like a weird spectrum. Because, you know, Annabelle is terrifying and Chucky's Chucky, man. The concept of Chucky is terrifying, but obviously the idea of a haunted doll is not just limited to film and TV, because there are several examples and notable real-life cases of apparent possession, including, possibly the most well-known, which is Annabelle. And whilst the like specific concept of a haunted or possessed doll is actually still a fairly modern idea, the idea of a creepy doll is much, much older. Now, dolls themselves have been around for thousands of years, dating back to some of the earliest civilizations like Egypt, Rome, and Greece. Back in 2004, there was an historic dig in an island in the Mediterranean, and they unearthed a 4,000-year-old stone doll. And there are some history museums that have examples of ancient Egyptian rag dolls, which were linen stuffed with like papyrus. Now obviously thousands of years ago, dolls like that would have been made by hand, and the modern manufacturing techniques of doll making were rooted in Germany in sort of the 15th century. Then after industrialization and the availability of new materials like porcelain and then eventually plastic, dolls became much more sort of mass produced to the point that they are today. This looks horrifying. This looks so creepy already. First little weird creepy fun fact of the video, I found somewhere that stated in 18th century Europe, parents would hang wax dolls in their children's bedrooms in order to basically scare them into staying in their rooms at night. And apparently it became known as doll torture or doll hanging, which is just horrifying. It's like an indoor scarecrow for children. Now obviously a lot of the earliest dolls are rag dolls, and it wasn't until the 19th century, when dolls were becoming more popular in sort of Europe and North America, that children began collecting porcelain dolls instead of rag dolls. And this was generally because obviously they looked a lot nicer and they tended to cost more money. During this time as well, dolls became really, really popular gifts to give to young girls, because obviously they reinforced the gender stereotypes that were in place at the time. They taught girls how to knit and sew, how to socialise with their babies. Obviously, this was from a time where girls were expected to become wives and homemakers, so dolls were often given as gifts with the idea of having this like instructional function to them. Although it was actually later on in the 19th century that the general designs of dolls started to change, because there was a big shift in mindset of like how parents viewed their children. Because it was basically around this time that parents started to view their children as children rather than like unfinished adults that needed to be brought up to speed with the rest of the adults. They started to think of childhood as a time of innocence and play, and that it was something to be like cherished and protected, not like rushed out of. So in turn, a lot of like dolls' faces started to take on this much more angelic, sort of rounded face, like cherub-like appearance. Now, the fear of dolls does have a proper name. I believe it's pronounced pediophobia. And it's classified under the broader term of, automatonophobia. I think I have enough syllables in there. Which is a fear of like humanoid figures, and it's also linked to the fear of puppets, which is puppophobia? I don't know. Phobia names are just, they're weird, man. Now, whilst a genuine phobia of dolls can be caused by things like traumatic events during childhood or negative exposure to dolls, it is often considered an irrational fear, albeit intense, and like many phobias, it can be completely debilitating for the people who suffer from it. However, many people who get like freaked out by dolls they don't have the phobia. It's more of like a easy to laugh it off, kind of jokey, like, oh, I don't like them, I can't look at them. And it's often a very sort of like culturally reinforced sense of unease that people seem to get around them. Again, due to things like films like Annabelle and Chucky and the horror stories that surround the idea of creepy dolls. And as I said, a lot of people can kind of dismiss it in a very jokey way of, oh, I don't like them, they freak me out. So it's more accurate to say that dolls in general, albeit not all dolls, they don't really frighten people so much as they just creep people out. Okay, I had to do the line work off camera really quickly just because I've not quite managed the art of doing it on camera at the moment. But yeah, generally speaking, most people find dolls unnerving and just a bit creepy. Now, what can actually make dolls feel like inherently creepy and unnerving to people is often based in psychology, and it's a lot to do with what your brain perceives as threatening. It's linked very closely with the idea of things being uncanny, and it leans into the sort of the uncanny valley territory of things, because there are two main factors that explain why we would find something creepy, which is familiarity. Something being familiar, but also ambiguous. Basically, dolls look lifelike and familiar. They have human-like faces, but they have no emotion. And it's that grey area that is what gives your brain the creeps, because obviously as humans, we rely very heavily on facial expression and that open display of emotion. So basically when you look at a doll, the very, very like primitive primal part of your brain registers that it is a face, i.e. another person, but because there is no emotion on it whatsoever, you can't read it, you can't get any kind of response from it, so your brain can't quite work out if it's a threat or not. There was a psychologist who put out a paper in 2013 of a working hypothesis of what creepy actually means, and it basically just all comes down to uncertainty. And he basically described it in the way that, like, if something is frightening, you scream, you run away from it. If something is disgusting, you know how to react to it, you know what to do. But if something is creepy, that like ambiguity, it might be dangerous, but you're not sure that it is, but you can't, there's something off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. There's actually a toy museum in London that has its own dedicated doll room, and I mean they've got like rag dolls, wax dolls, porcelain dolls, Victorian dolls, dolls from like Japan and China, like they've got a lot of dolls. And the doll room is the last room before the museum's exit. The museum has actually reported that quite a lot of their visitors cannot make it through that room. They can't manage it. So they instead trek all the way back through the museum to the entrance rather than go through that room and exit. One of the people who works at the museum, who's worked there for like over 7 years, they did an interview with them, and they said it's usually the adults who get freaked out the most by that room. Children, generally speaking, absolutely fine with it. They can handle it, no problem. And they noticed that it happened more often during the winter, when obviously it got darker outside earlier, so that room was just that like little bit darker as well. And he described it that people were behaving as if they'd just come out of like a haunted house rather than a museum. Now, whilst dolls are primarily intended as toys for children, even thousands of years ago, I don't know how they know this, but even thousands of years ago in places like Greece and Rome and Egypt, the dolls that were made were often given to children as playthings. But there are iterations of like dolls and figurines that have been used by different cultures and countries for various reasons over thousands of years. Now, going back to ancient Egypt for a second, they had something that were called puppets. Now, there are more modern versions of this as well, but they were used in ceremonies to rid the body of any evil in order that someone's soul could be sent to God after death. However, most puppets were then actually used to place curses on people, similar to the idea of like a voodoo doll, and the dolls would then sort of latch themselves onto the soul of the person they were supposed to be cursing. I think this is one of the most trust the process looks I have done in a very long time. Now, puppets themselves kind of fall under their own category of doll, and they're often used a lot in like folk magic and witchcraft, and they're generally made to represent a specific person in order to cast spells on them or to aid them through the use of magic. And they're made from all sorts of different materials. All over the world, each culture generally has their own variation of a puppet, and the intentions and motivations for making them, as well as the materials that are most often used, again, will just vary greatly depending on where you go. There were a few notable examples that I found of different cultures having their own sort of puppets, one of which was the German kitchen witch. Now, the idea of a kitchen witch is to bring good sort of energy and good intentions into a home kitchen and help prevent kitchen disasters, such as undercooked food or burnt food. But it's believed in order for a kitchen witch to work, a small ritual or prayer has to be done beforehand. And it's all based on the idea that the kitchen was one of the most important rooms in the home, because it was a source of remedies and the nutrition that was needed to maintain the body. Within folk magic and witchcraft, that kind of thing, there were a whole host of other different types of puppet as well. Things like love puppets, prosperity puppets, healing, protection, and a whole bunch of other puppets. And each one was created and infused with different items that were relevant to the purpose of that puppet. I remember, for example, I think the protection puppet had sage infused with it, because often sage is used within witchcraft to cleanse and protect. There are a lot of other items from different cultures as well that were kind of linked to puppets and these types of things. So I saw reference to things like corn dollies or corn mothers, which were an old sort of straw figurine type thing that were made as part of harvest customs in Europe. You've got corn husk dolls from Native America, and there's a doll that I don't know how it's pronounced, I'm really sorry. Hoko? But it's given to young women of age and pregnant women in Japan in order to offer protection to the woman and child. So obviously dolls do have a very long sort of cultural history of being associated with rituals and magic, not just as children's toys. Demonic or spiritual possession also has a very long cultural history, with a huge number of variations of it being found in pretty much any culture that you can think of. So both things have existed for thousands of years across the world, but the specific idea of a haunted doll, or at least in the terms that we tend to think of today, is actually still a fairly modern thing. Now, when you hear the term haunted doll, most people tend to think of the old, Victorian-esque dolls with, big dresses and loads of ruffles and the creepy porcelain faces. But the concept of malevolent dolls didn't really gain any attention until the 20th century, thanks to the film and entertainment industry. Because it was during this time that the industry were able to realistically portray safely inanimate dolls as dangerously animate. Animate? Animate? Is that right? That doesn't sound right. Now, the very earliest example of this was a film released in 1936 called The Devil Doll, and it was adapted from a novel called Burn Witch Burn, and the film itself has become a bit of a cult film. To summarise, in relation to haunted dolls, there's this French scientist who's worried about human overpopulation, so he develops a formula to shrink humans down in order to preserve the resources that we have available. But the formula ends up in the hands of an escaped prisoner who was wrongfully convicted. He basically goes on a revenge mission to use this formula on the people who landed him in jail. The specific relevance that I found is that there's a bit where the escaped prisoner disguises himself as an old woman, selling these lifelike dolls at a market stall, when in reality it's people. Now, possibly the most notable early example of the possessed doll trope as we know it today was an episode of The Twilight Zone that aired in 1963, centred on a dysfunctional family who buy their young daughter a wind-up doll called Talkie Tina. Now, interestingly, the mother in this family is called Annabelle. Also, the Talkie Tina doll was based on a real doll that was out at the time called Chatty Cathy. The doll's name is Christy, and during the episode, the stepfather is really, really hostile to Christy and the doll. Now, obviously, the doll was one of those wind-up ones that made noises and said phrases, and where it originally started out by saying things like, "My name is Talkie Tina, I love you," those kind of lines, it suddenly started saying things like, "I don't like you, to the stepfather when he was alone. Now, the stepfather is convinced that it's like an issue with the manufacturer, or maybe it's his wife playing some kind of elaborate trick on him as a way of kind of getting him back for being hostile toward their daughter. But the doll gradually begins engaging in more like elaborate conversations with him, and he ends up trying to throw the doll away. But he then receives a phone call where he hears the doll's voice threatening to kill him. So obviously he gets this phone call, he freaks out, so he goes back to the bin to try and retrieve the doll, but, as I'm sure you can guess, the doll is not there. So he goes back inside the house and he finds that the doll is safely tucked up in bed with young Christy. Throughout the course of the episode, the stepfather tries like numerous different ways to get rid of this doll, including like putting it in a vice, using a blowtorch on it, even like a circular saw, but none of it works. So he puts it in a burlap sack, puts it in the bin, and puts like weights on the lid so that it can't get out. Now at this point, Annabelle, the mother, is just packing everything up to leave. She's packing up Christy and all their things, basically telling the stepfather, like, no, you need professional help. This has got too far now. The stepfather obviously panics and doesn't want them to leave, so he offers to retrieve the doll and give it back to Christy if it means that they'll stay. Annabelle ends up agreeing to stay, so the stepfather goes to retrieve the doll and, true to his word, he gives it back to Christy. Now, that night, he hears a noise, so he goes into Christy's room to check on her, but the doll isn't there. Then, when he goes downstairs, he trips on the doll and ends up suffering fatal injuries. Then, when Annabelle comes down and finds his body next to the doll says, "My name is Talkie Tina, and you'd better be nice to me." So at which point, Anna freaks out and realises the whole thing was true. The closing narration of the episode basically states, we know dolls can't talk, they can't really murder people, but to a child caught in the middle of disruption, disorder, a dysfunctional home, a doll or a toy can become a friend or a guardian or a defender. Now, this episode of The Twilight Zone went on to be parodied, a lot, by a number of different TV shows. Obviously, it was featured and parodied in an episode of The Simpsons' Treehouse of Horrors. There was an episode of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and even an episode of Johnny Bravo. Talkie Tina was also the inspiration behind the character of Gabby Gabby in Toy Story 4, which, fun, disturbing little fact. So despite the origins of the haunted doll seeming to come from sort of film and TV rather than any particular folklore or legend, there are a number of real-life claims around haunted dolls. The success of the films around this idea led to a huge rise in sales of dolls that were claimed to be haunted or possessed or cursed on places like eBay and Amazon and Etsy. You can literally still find people today listing haunted dolls for sale on those sites. I mean, it's like Facebook Marketplace as well. You can find people selling haunted dolls. I think of all of those things, I would trust Facebook Marketplace the least for buying any kind of haunted doll. For the possibility of something actually being wrong with it. I don't know what. Facebook Marketplace just gives me weird vibes in that regard. There was actually a folklore professor who, for starters, dream job, who said that ghost tours, adverts for haunted hotels, and any other kind of monetary transaction build on these pre-existing beliefs and narratives that come from folklore. And the fact that people buy and sell ghostly material doesn't take anything away from the material's value for folklore researchers. If I'm kind of interpreting correctly, it's basically them just saying because it's been sort of commercialized doesn't take away from the relevance that it still has to things like folklore and legends and history. Obviously, as I said before, one of the most well-known cases of a real-life haunted doll is Annabelle. Annabelle is quite a well-known doll in that regard anyway, due to the connection to Ed and Lorraine Warren, which we'll come to later, but mainly due to the character's portrayal and depiction in the Conjuring film universe franchise. But there are other haunted dolls that have become infamous in their own right, including what is believed to be the oldest example, known as Robert, or Robert the Doll. I got eyeshadow on the side of my nose and I didn't realise, and I've kind of blended it in now, and I'm very upset about it. Ella. Robert, or Robert the Doll, is an allegedly haunted doll that is currently exhibited at a museum in Key West in Florida, and is often referred to as Key West's most cursed item. The doll originally belonged to someone named Robert Eugene Otto, who was described as a very eccentric artist. He was part of quite a prominent family in Key West. It's believed the doll was manufactured in Germany by the same company that actually manufactured the very first teddy bear in honour of Theodore Roosevelt. One little fact there. Now, it's actually believed that Robert, the doll, was actually never intended to be sold as a toy. He was most likely part of a set that was created for a window display of like clowns or jesters, but he was bought by Otto's grandfather during a trip to Germany in 1904 and was then given to Otto when he was young. And it's actually believed that like the little sailor's suit that the doll wears would have belonged to Otto and been a suit that he had worn as a child, because the company didn't supply that outfit at all. I just noticed photos of like the film Annabelle doll, where it's obviously meant to be all like old and weathered. The blush is a little bit like splotchy in places, so I'm gonna try and go for that. Now, is it just gonna look like I haven't blended it? Probably. Oh, actually, I don't know. I feel like it kind of works, maybe. Anyway, whilst Otto was given the doll when he was a child, his relationship with the doll continued well on to adulthood for him, in a way that many people would have described as unhealthy. He would reportedly take the doll everywhere with him. He would talk about it in the first person as if it was a real person, and just generally treated it like a living being rather than a doll. Now, according to legend, Otto began blaming all of his like childhood mishaps on the doll. Now, obviously, this could have probably just been brushed off as like childish storytelling or an overactive imagination. However, adults in his life did begin to notice some kind of weird stuff start happening, especially as Otto and the doll got older. Now, I did find one like weirdly detailed story about a particular instance of something weird happening. So, I'll be honest, I don't necessarily know how true or accurate it is, but it was in reference to the first odd thing that happened in that one night, Otto, when he was around 10 years old, woke up to see Robert, the doll, sitting at the foot of his bed. Just a few moments later, Otto's mother woke up to the sound of her son screaming, and the sound of like furniture being like moved and shifted and upended in his room. And when they were finally able to get the door open, they found Otto curled up on his bed, like screaming and crying, and Robert sitting at the foot of the bed. And Otto's response to this was, "Robert did it," which apparently was a phrase that he then went on to use a lot, which honestly kind of reminds me of Drop Dead Fred. But apparently his parents would hear Otto upstairs talking to Robert, but they would hear him get a response in like a completely different voice, which, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that the doll is alive and possessed. I mean, I used to do like voices for my toys when I was a kid, so now Otto went off to study art in New York and then Paris, during which time Robert the doll stayed at the family home. Otto then later married and moved back to the family home, which he called the artist house. After Otto had moved back in, Robert could often be seen sitting in the upstairs window, as Otto claimed that Robert needed his own room. And from there, school children started sharing stories about how the doll would disappear and then reappear. The story spread really quickly, and school children especially just generally started avoiding that house in general. Otto passed away in 1974, followed shortly by his wife about 2 years later, and the home, still containing the doll, was then sold. The new resident lived at that house for about 20 years. However, during that time, visitors to the house swore that they could hear footsteps in the attic, as well as like giggling sounds, and some of them claimed that Robert's expression would change if he badmouthed Otto in front of him. The homeowner also stated that Robert would like move about the house on his own, and basically after 20 years of his shenanigans, they were done. So they donated the doll to the museum in Key West in 1994. Now, as we've discussed previously, with pretty much any legend, urban legend, folk story, anything like that, there are a number of variations depending on who you ask. And the case is still true for this, including the origin of the doll in the first place. Some people believe that the doll was given to Otto by a young girl from the Bahamas, either as a gift or as retaliation for some sort of wrongdoing, while there are others who believe that the doll was given to him by a servant of the estate who had been mistreated by his parents, so as punishment she cursed the doll with voodoo and black magic. Other legends as well would state that the doll would move like voodoo figurines around the room and was aware of what was going on around him, and that the doll vanished after Otto's house changed hands after his death. Now, according to local folklore, Robert has caused car accidents, broken bones, job loss, divorce, and a wide array of other misfortunes. Since his donation to the museum, visitors have flocked there in huge numbers to get a look at him. He's appeared on TV shows, he's a stop on like a ghost tour in the area, he's inspired horror movies, both directly and indirectly. Like, there is a series of films about Robert the doll. He has his own social media accounts, you can buy replicas of the doll, books, t-shirts, coasters, and apparently you can even volunteer to be locked in with Robert in the museum after dark. Now, one of the craziest facts that I read about him in relation to his sort of like infamy within the museum is that museum workers have stated that Robert receives 1 to 3 letters a day. Albeit, most of these are apology letters, because a lot of people who visit the doll in the museum have reported post-museum misfortunes for failing to respect Robert or for openly disrespecting him, so they will often write to him to beg for his forgiveness. People will also write in asking for advice, asking for Robert to hex or curse people who have done them wrong, and according to the museum, they've received over 1,000 letters, all of which are kept and catalogued. No, I creased my eye and it transferred. Now, as well as thousands of letters, obviously in keeping with modern times and his own social media account, Robert also receives emails as well as gifts and donations, money, and apparently even like joints, which the museum have openly said like it's really, really inappropriate because they're a museum at the end of the day. And at some point it became known that Robert had a sweet tooth, so people began leaving him like sweets and sending him candy. And apparently there was one instance where they received a box containing 8 bags of peppermints, a small card, and no return address. Now, even though this doll is like over 100 years old, you can find like really recent first-hand accounts of people who have been to visit him and what they've experienced and what happened. Like, I literally found a Reddit thread of people discussing their visit to see Robert the doll. Now, obviously, it could all just be coincidence, but the general consensus surrounding Robert is that as long as you are respectful to him, you know, you ask permission before you take any photos, you thank him when you leave, you should be fine. However, some of the examples I found from people who had been to visit him and then experienced these post-visit misfortunes are genuinely a bit eerie. There was one account that I found about a man who had visited with his brother and sister-in-law, and whilst he and his sister-in-law had been very respectful, asking permission before taking photos, thanking before they left, all of that kind of stuff, his brother was openly disrespectful to the doll. And immediately after they left the museum, the brother and the sister-in-law got a phone call to say that the plumbing in their rental property had completely backed up. And the guy who had gone to visit his brother and gone to the museum with them, when he returned from that trip, he'd lost his job. And apparently the brother and the sister-in-law got divorced like 6 months later. Things like that, it's like it's a string of unfortunate events. Whether it's connected or it's just a coincidence, it's a little weird, I can't lie, but not all of the tales were quite that dramatic or costly. A lot of them were to do with like weird glitches happening on cameras and videos that had been taken. So there was one where like they'd taken photos of him, but then when they then went to look at the photos later on, they were completely gone. Other cases where the photos had actually duplicated themselves on the SD card but with like different timestamps. Lots of just weird stuff, for lack of a better phrase. There was another tale I saw about a family who had gone to visit the doll, and whilst this family were very respectful, followed all the rules, that kind of thing, they witnessed another family who were openly disrespectful, like mocking him, laughing at him, that kind of thing. Now, this first family actually went back in to Robert to apologise for the behaviour of this other group of people and just kind of talk to him a little bit about it and just generally being like, yeah, I'm really sorry about them. And apparently they then heard like a music box start to play for a few minutes, and when they were leaving the museum they mentioned to the staff members about how beautiful the music was, and the staff member explained that the music box in Robert's room hadn't worked for years. The only time that music plays is when Robert is happy. Now, one of the family members didn't believe this at all. He thought it was like a bit of a tourist trap. So he asked the staff member if he could see the sound system. So the staff member showed him, and when he saw it, it was completely covered in dust. And it was very obvious that it hadn't been touched, let alone fixed, for years. Even Ozzy Osbourne has blamed some of his problems with like his health and sort of general bad luck on an interaction that he had with the doll years ago. He initially visited the doll during one of the shows that he did with his son. However, Ozzy did then buy a replica of the doll and blow it up with a water cannon, so he kinda bought it on himself. Now, whilst Robert is like the oldest known haunted doll, it wasn't until his donation to the museum in the 90s that his story really became known beyond sort of local legend. However, 5 years after the release of the Twilight Zone episode, a story was released from the paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren regarding a haunted doll that would go on to become one of the most well-known characters in horror in recent years, which of course was Annabelle. So the original Annabelle, which was a Raggedy Ann doll, was given to a young student nurse by her mother in 1970, who brought it back to her apartment, which she shared with a fellow student nurse. So not long after this, both women began to notice that Annabelle seemed to sort of move in and out of rooms of her own accord, and they then began finding notes around the apartment that said things like, "Help me," and it was written on parchment paper which neither of the women owned. Now, at one point, the boyfriend of one of these women was visiting for the afternoon, and he thought he heard noises coming from one of the bedrooms that sounded like someone trying to break in. Now, when he went into the room, he found no signs of forced entry, but he did see the doll lying face down on the floor, and then he suddenly felt like this searing pain on his chest, and he looked down to find bloody claw marks running across it. However, 2 days later, they'd completely disappeared. There is apparently another version of the story where he was attacked after he woke up from a nap by the doll, but either way, the encounter led the two women to invite a medium over to try and explain what was happening. The medium then held a seance and explained that the doll had been possessed by the spirit of a young girl named Annabelle, whose body had been found years earlier on the site that the apartment building was situated, and explained that, you know, the spirit was benevolent and just wanted to be loved and cared for. So following this, the two women felt bad for the spirit and for Annabelle, so they allowed her to take permanent residence within the doll. Now, despite accepting the spirit, at some point the two women were trying to get rid of the doll from their home. So they contacted a priest, who then contacted another priest, who then got in touch with the Warrens. Now, the Warrens, they claimed that the problem started when the two women had taken pity on the doll because they believed it was actually a demonic force that was in search of a human host that had possessed the doll, not this benevolent spirit. Their account of this case stated, and I quote, "Spirits do not possess inanimate objects like houses or toys. They possess people. An inhuman spirit can attach itself to a place or object, and that is what occurred in the Annabelle case. The spirit manipulated the doll and created the illusion of it being alive in order to get recognition. Truly, the spirit was not looking to stay attached to the doll, it was looking to possess a human host." Side note, I need to do the eyebrows, and they're basically just two very thin lines, so I'm going to do them off camera so I don't mess them up. I don't want to talk about it. Now, Ed and Lorraine's claims of demonic possession was based on signs such as teleportation, i.e. the doll moving from room to room, materialization, which is the parchment paper notes, and the mark of the beast being the claw marks on the boyfriend's chest. Hold on, I've not mastered the art of lip lining while talking yet. So following this, they subsequently ordered an exorcism to take place at the apartment, and they then removed the doll. Now, following the exorcism, the Warrens documented several paranormal experiences involving the doll, The first being immediately after they left. Whilst they were driving home with the doll, Lorraine claims that the brakes on the car failed or stalled several times, resulting in near disastrous crashes. But once Ed doused the doll in holy water, all of the problems with the brakes disappeared. Once they arrived home, they initially placed the doll in Ed's study, but they then reported that the doll began to levitate and just move around the house on her own. And even when they placed her in a locked outer building, she would reappear inside the house. They decided to take Annabelle to their occult museum, where, despite the fact that the museum is now closed, she remains to this day inside a locked glass cabinet with several carvings of different prayers and the warning that reads, "Positively do not open." However, even after she was locked away, there were further stories of people who encountered this demonic entity. One was a young priest who had visited and sort of generally dismissed the idea of this demonic creature and the powers of the doll. And when Ed warned him about, don't mock this creature, don't mock this doll, the young priest just laughed him off. However, after leaving, the priest was involved in a near-fatal crash which completely totaled his car, and he claims to have seen Annabelle in his rear-view mirror just before he crashed. Years later, there was another visitor to the museum who was apparently tapping on the glass and just laughing about the whole thing and how silly it was that people believed this doll was evil and demonic. But on his way home, he reportedly lost control of his motorbike and crashed. He was killed instantly, but his girlfriend barely survived, and she stated at the time of the accident they had been laughing about the doll. Now, if you don't know too much about them, Ed and Lorraine Warren have come under huge amounts of scrutiny for their stories and their claims over the years, and generally a lot of people have written them off as charlatans and con men, especially as they became sort of more and more well known. And the stories about Annabelle are no different, because everything I have just told you about Annabelle the doll has come from them. None of the stories have ever been corroborated. The names of the priest and the motorcyclist who died never been shared. The two nurses from the beginning, they never came forward with their story, and the priests involved with the exorcism, there was no mention of the exorcism from them or anything like that. So many people have dismissed the story of Annabelle in particular as being just another tall tale told by the Warrens that was then hugely popularised by the Conjuring franchise. However, with things like Robert the Doll and the numerous first-hand accounts that are still happening to this day, it's a little bit harder to just dismiss. I've come to the last section of the story, and I think what I have to do is the finishing touches of the look. So, 1, I'm getting better at tying this all together, I think. 2, let me just go do some finishing touches, and we can then come back and finish up with the story. Okay, I'm fully aware this is not a biblically accurate costume for this character, but I realised far too late that I didn't actually have the right kind of costume for this, so I've had to kind of hodgepodge it together a little bit. But moving back to the realm of this but real life. So I did find records and sources to do with several other notable haunted dolls all across the world. And like I said earlier, at any given time you can find hundreds of haunted dolls being sold online through various different sites. Now, other than Robert and obviously Annabelle, one of the oldest tales that I found to do with a haunted doll in real life comes from modern Japanese folklore, which centers around a young girl named, bear with me, Okiku. I'm very sorry if I got that wrong, please feel free to correct me. But she received a large doll as a gift from her brother when she was young, and this was in 1918. So Okiku gave the doll her own name, and when Okiku died, her family believed that her spirit was then inhabiting the doll because the hair on the doll was growing. The doll apparently now resides in a temple, and it's claimed that there is a priest who regularly takes care of the doll and trims the still growing hair. Over in Australia, there was a man who discovered a doll whilst he was visiting an abandoned building in 1972. He named this doll Letter Me Out. because of the doll's alleged supernatural abilities, and he claims that people have seen the doll move in front of them, as well as the doll leaving like visible scuff marks around his house. And if I remember correctly, like he's been on TV with this doll quite a few times as well. Over in Canada, there was a porcelain baby doll that was made sometime between 1910 and 1920 named Mandy. Mandy was donated to a museum in 1991 after, again, claims that it possessed supernatural abilities. And apparently the doll's eyes are meant to follow museum visitors whenever they walk around. And interestingly enough, I found a big bunch of articles that were released in August of this year, so just a couple of months ago, about a haunted doll in South Yorkshire here in the UK that allegedly has like a hatred towards men, having attacked over 17 of them. So the doll is called Elizabeth because, of course, I believe she's like a bridal doll, or I've seen her referred to as a bridal doll, so she's wearing like a wedding dress. While she's only caused physical injuries to men, she has never harmed a woman, and she seems to hold like no hostility towards women at all. So the owners of the doll, one of whom is a paranormal investigator, believe that the spirit that is inhabiting this doll is potentially like a jilted bride or someone who was mistreated by a man during her lifetime. The doll allegedly attacks men that visit her in the museum that she's kept in, causing things like scratch marks and in some cases like a burning sensation around the neck. But the owners claim that she's also capable of setting off fire alarms, throwing perfume bottles across the room, causing weird glitchy video interference. And the owner of the museum and the doll has stated that he believes one of the reasons the doll is acting out so much, like at the moment, is because the museum has recently acquired a few items from the Conjuring franchise, which has driven some of the museum's visitors' attentions away from her. Therefore, she is acting out of jealousy. He's also been quoted as saying that he believes this is the most haunted doll in the world. Any articles that I find relating to this are literally from like 2 months ago. I found there was one article that was published 3 days ago prior to me filming this. So this feels like a very, very new story because I'd never heard of it before. So it will be interesting to follow that particular story and see how it holds up sort of later on down the line, because I mean, attacking 17 men and being the most haunted doll in the world, like that's a fairly big claim. But what do you guys think? Do you think there is any kind of truth to this idea of like haunted dolls, or is it local legends playing on the inherently creepy and unnerving nature of dolls? Let me know in the comments down below if you've ever had an experience with a haunted doll, or if you've ever been to see one of them in the museums. I would love to know your experiences with it, because like I said, it's very interesting reading the first-hand accounts of people who have interacted with these items. I don't personally find dolls that creepy. Like the stereotypical dolls that people find really creepy and unnerving, the ones that are made to look creepy specifically for things like horror films and stuff like that, they do unnerve me a little bit, but that's kind of the point. But like dolls in general, I don't. Let me know your guys' thoughts as well. Dolls, yay, nay, creepy? Let me know as well any other myths and monsters and legends that you would like me to cover in the future. I do still have a few more episodes planned for the rest of October. Let me know what you think of the look as well. It was a journey. I've never done a look like this with this kind of level of like shading and contouring, so I am actually quite happy with how it's turned out. Other than that, thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you all have a fabulous day. Why did I say it like that? Other than that, I will see you all in the next one. Bye. Last week we looked at... What the hell did I talk about last week? Haunted, creepy ass dolls. We were looking at the history of some of the real life cases of haunted dolls and all that spooky dooky stuff. Today we are looking at another piece of Irish folklore that I've wanted to do since I did my Banshee video, and it has actually also been quite a highly requested video for me to do as well. So today we are looking at the legend surrounding the Headless Horseman. Horseman? Horsemen. Horseman. Men? The Headless Riders on horses. I have a fairly ambitious makeup look to do for this one, which I'll be honest, I've never done before, so I'm scared. But I've got a lot to talk about, so let me go get prepped and then we can get started. So who or what is a headless horseman? So I think for most people, myself included, when you think of a headless horseman, you think of Sleepy Hollow, or the legend of Sleepy Hollow, and it's a headless rider on a black horse, sometimes carrying like a pumpkin for a head. But the actual origins of the headless horseman are so much older than that. Unfortunately, because I have to do this element of the makeup kind of first, it's going to ruin my expression for the rest of the video, so apologies. Oh god, it's so much worse when I smile. So the headless horseman is not like a single figure within mythology or an individual like character, as a lot of people seem to think it is. So it's actually considered an archetype, like a blueprint of a mythical figure that has appeared in folklore throughout Europe since the Middle Ages, generally depicted as riders on horseback who have no head. So the legend of Sleepy Hollow is probably the most sort of well-known example of the headless horseman, and it is usually the one that people think of when they hear the phrase. But the story of the headless horseman, obviously based on the short story published in 1820, the inspiration for that came from the original European folklore. Now, because the legend of the headless horseman is found across so many different cultures and different countries, the legend of each one obviously varies slightly in origin and just general story. And don't worry, I will be covering a lot of them, but probably the most well-known, and I think what a lot of people consider to be the like original version, is from Irish folklore, which is known as the Dullahan. Now, I mentioned the Dullahan very briefly in my video on the Banshees, mainly because of the connection that it has to the Death Coach, which obviously the Banshees have a connection to as well. But generally speaking, the Dullahan is pictured as a headless rider on a black horse, or as a coachman, either with like just no head at all, or carrying it under his arm, or sometimes like under his leg. So if you have seen the Banshee video, do you remember I spoke about the Bunworth Banshee to do with like Reverend Bunworth? It was written about in a book called Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland, and it turns out that the author, a guy called Thomas Crofton Croker, was actually like the great-grandson of Reverend Bunworth, so the story was a bit like, Turns out, Mr. Croker also wrote about the Dullahan in that book, as well as honestly quite a lot of just very well-known Irish mythology and like folklore in general. But first little fun side note of the video, because Mr. Croker was a bit of a controversial man with regards to his work, and it's kind of wild. Basically, he used to do loads of like field trips and just general sort of research, and he would like travel around collecting tales and traditions from Irish people just all over the place. And during his life he released quite a few books, but the Fairy Legends book is the most well known. But when he was writing the book, or like planning for it, he actually lost all of the like manuscript notes that he had for it, so he had to basically reconstruct the whole thing with the help of like a bunch of other writers and people that he knew. But a lot of the people that helped him basically felt that he didn't acknowledge their help at all within the book, and there was a whole big thing about it. But basically a lot of people accused him of like taking other people's stories and then just publishing them under his own name. So as useful as he was for my research into Irish folklore, he's basically just like the Irish version of Gilderoy Lockhart. Croker was also actually accused of being of Anglo-Irish descent rather than like just pure Irish descent, and he was really heavily criticised for his like portrayal of Irish history and Irish traditions, because people often felt that he put like a very sort of comical distortion on them almost, and he generally wrote about them in quite a patronising way. He embellished his stories quite a lot as well, and people found that he wasn't like super true to the traditions and the history because he added a lot of sort of literary embellishments to it. Despite that though, his work was really successful, and especially the Fairy Legends book, which was apparently instrumental in attracting a wider audience to Irish folklore beyond like the English speaking world. The first part of this work was actually published in 1824 and was then translated into German by the brothers Grimm, who are obviously two of the most well-known storytellers of folk tales and just folklore publishers. So yes, Thomas Croker, very, very influential, if not controversial little man. And I say little because he was 4'10". Now within his Fairy Legends book, Croker obviously talks about the Dullahan, and I believe it's one of the earliest written sort of like visual descriptions of the Dullahan, and I'm going to apologise in advance because he described it as such a head no mortal ever saw before. It looked like a large cream cheese hung round with black puddings. No speck of colour enlivened the ashy paleness of the depressed features. The skin lay stretched over the unearthly surface, almost like the parchment head of a drum. 2 fiery eyes of prodigious circumference, with a strange and irregular motion, flashed like meteors. According to more modern storytellers, the Dullahan had a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. Said mouth of razor-sharp teeth forms a grin that basically goes from ear to ear, and it has these massive eyes that just constantly dart round, and it's also described that the flesh has acquired the smell, colour and texture of mouldy cheese, which is just vile. So, what is the deal with the Dullahan? So, similar to banshees, the Dullahan is considered a dark fairy or dark fae creature, otherwise known as an unseelie fairy, and he's again considered a sort of omen or predictor of death. But unlike the banshees, it is often believed that the Dullahan has a bit more of a hands-on approach, in that he is actively looking for souls to take with him to the afterlife, and the whole face-splitting, ear-to-ear grin is sort of representative of the joy that he finds in taking the lives of others. Now, he can appear as a horseman, or he can appear as a coachman driving a horse-drawn carriage. And he's usually spotted, driving out of a graveyard, and then he makes his way through towns and villages after dark. It's said that he can only speak once on his journey, and that is to basically say the name of the person that he has chosen to take with him to die. And once that name is called, the person's soul is called to death, and there is nothing that can be done about it. Now, going back to the whole death coach thing for a second as well, because obviously I know I covered it a little bit in the Banshee video, but the coach itself is endlessly fascinating. It is referred to by a number of different names. So you have the death coach, sometimes it's referred to as the silent coach. I saw it referred to as the death coach because of the fact that it's silent, but in other cases it's known as the headless coach, which is then driven by the Dullahan. Now, Mr. Croker also wrote about the death coach, and again provided a very vivid description for it, which, whilst terrifying and horrible, I can't lie, it's kind of badass. So the axle of the carriage is made from a human spine, the spokes on the wheels are all human thigh bones, and later writings added additional details like the fact that there are 2 hollow skulls that hang from the carriage like lanterns that are then set with candles, and the hammercloth, which is this big, elaborate, decorative piece of fabric that covers, the coachman's seat. It's usually really, really ornate and overly embellished. Is made of a really pale material, damp with, mildew and being chewed away by worms. And in other places, I saw it described as basically the hammercloth was made of, dried, stretched out human skin. It's believed as well that the death coach is drawn by 6 headless black horses, and it travelled so fast that flames and fire would come out of their nostrils and from their hooves when it hit the ground. Although I've just realised, I don't know how flame comes out of their nostrils if they have no head. Maybe if they do have a head, the flames come out, and if it's not, then it's the hooves. But yeah, basically the coach travelled so fast it was known to set bushes on fire at the side of the road as it passed. And the belief also went that as the horsemen and the carriage travelled through the village or the town or wherever they were going, any locks on the doors or the gates of homes would automatically open, basically kind of signalling that there was no getting away from him, there was no escaping him. From my previous video on Irish folklore, obviously the death coach is representative of the inevitability of death, because the belief is that once it comes to Earth, it cannot return empty, and once someone has been sort of marked for death by it, there is nothing that mortal beings can do to change that. Again, similar to the horseman. There is also another element of the belief that I didn't know about, and this is in relation to both the carriage and just the horseman himself, and it's that if you opened your door as the coach or the horseman was going by, you would end up with buckets of blood being splashed over you, or you'd be blinded. Which, to be fair, I'm pretty sure if you had a bucket of blood splashed over you, you wouldn't really be able to see anything anyway. However, if you were lucky, you would carry gold somewhere on your person, as it was believed that the sight of gold would send the Dullahan back to the depths of darkness from where he came. I couldn't find too much about like why gold is meant to send him away, because he's representative of like the inevitability of death and that kind of thing, but I don't know whether it's like a fairy thing, like a fairies in general, or certain types of fairies, they don't like gold. I don't know if it's specific to him. Like I said, I couldn't really find too much about that aspect. It was just accepted that gold would protect you from him. Now, going back to dear old Mr. Croker for a second, one of his stories that involved the Dullahan was called Hanlon's Mill. Basically, in this story, there is a man called Mick who is travelling back to the estate that he works on, and on his journey he sees a black coach being drawn by 6 headless black horses, driven by a headless coachman wearing black. Now, Mick, beyond the fact that all 6 horses and the driver had no head, the main thing that he remarked was that the coach and the horses in the ride, they made absolutely no sound, even though they were going past them like insanely fast. There was no noise that came from it whatsoever, but he just writes it off. But the next morning, Mick receives news that the lord of the estate, like the master of the estate that he worked on, despite being in perfect health the previous day, had very suddenly had a fit and then died. Now, the Dullahan is believed to go out searching for souls to take with him to the afterlife, but there's a number of quite interesting theories regarding the Dullahan's ability to see, because some modern interpretations have it that the Dullahan has the ability to see with his severed head, which he basically holds up almost like a lantern and uses it to like scan the countryside for victims, like some kind of weird freaky periscope. However, in another one of Croker's tales known as the Harvest Dinner, the headless coach is described as a blind thief, and Croker assumes that he can't see or lacks sight because he lacks a head. Which, I mean, it makes sense. Another note regarding the Dullahan's sight, or potential lack of sight, you will often see the Dullahan depicted as using a human spine as a whip. Now, this additional detail comes from more modern interpretations from like around the 21st century, whereas in Croker's original tales, the Dullahan is described as just bearing a long whip. But in the Harvest Dinner tale, he strikes the horses with the whip so hard that he almost strikes a witness in the eye, which nearly blinds them. And Croker worked out from that the horseman, just purely out of habit, attempts to destroy the eyes of anyone who sees him. Croker's reasoning for this in particular was basically that the horseman was jealous in that his wrath would turn to these onlookers because they had the ability to be onlookers, whereas he didn't, because he didn't have a head, so he couldn't look. Now, whether it is jealousy over witnesses' ability to see him, or more in keeping that he just didn't want them to see him, I don't know, but I did find several references to this behaviour of like blinding witnesses, and I'll be honest, of the two, I think it is more likely that it's he's just blinding witnesses so they can't see what he's doing because it's all spooky and mysterious, rather than he's jealous that they have eyes. Now, before we jump into the origins of the Irish Dullahan, I meant to say at the beginning of the video, so I'm going to just say it now. I apologise in advance for every single pronunciation that I am going to attempt for the rest of this video. We're talking Irish, like ancient and old Irish, Scottish, Welsh, like there's a lot of words that I am definitely going to get wrong. I will try my best, but just on the whole, I am very, very sorry. Please do feel free to correct me in the comments on any of the pronunciations, because I do genuinely try to get them right. Now, the origins of the Irish Dullahan specifically is very interesting, because there are many who believe he is the embodiment of an ancient Celtic god known as Cromdubh, meaning black crooked one or dark bent one, who was in turn based on the god Cruach, which was a pagan god from pre-Christian Ireland. Now, according to Christian writers, so immediately take that with a pinch of salt, this particular god was worshipped through the form of human sacrifice in exchange for like milk and grains, which suggested that he may have had some kind of function as like almost a fertility god, but the practice of worshipping him was ended by St. Patrick. Now, the description of this god is of a gold figure surrounded by 12 bronze or stone figures, and it's been interpreted by some people to represent like the sun being then surrounded by the signs of the zodiac, which could suggest that Crom also had some kind of function as a solar deity as well. Now, the method of human sacrifice that this particular god demanded was, can you guess? It was decapitation. Now, it was during the 6th century, when Christianity came over to Ireland and started to gain in popularity, that these like ritualistic sacrifices and worship of the god were condemned and then stopped. And it was around this time that the story of the Dullahan first started kind of becoming a bit more common, as it was believed that Crom Dubh had taken the physical form of the Headless Horseman in order to continue getting the sacrifices that he called for. I'm really hoping this comes together, because right now this is looking like a hot mess. I actually have an interesting little side note about decapitation or headlessness. The ancient Celtics believed that the soul was like in the head. So if during a battle you came across a foe and said foe was a worthy foe, you would then take their head to add to your prestige. From my understanding is similar to like, you know, the Dothraki braids in like Game of Thrones. It's basically like a trophy. But there was also a belief that if you attached the head to a pole near your home, the head would then scream when the enemy got near. Now, if you go over to Scotland, the most prominent tale of a headless horseman is that of a ghost rather than a fairy, or unseelie fairy. And it is a ghost of a man named Ewan, who haunts the roads of a place called Mull. I think it's pronounced Mull. Mull? Now, the tale goes that Ewan was the only son and heir of the 5th chief of the MacLean's family of Lochbuie. I'm trying. And he was married to a daughter of the MacDougall clan of Lorne. Now, his wife was a very greedy, very ambitious woman, and she was constantly nagging Ewan to basically try and get more out of his father, more lands, more livestock, just anything she could get her hands on. Now, in 1538, urged on by his wife, Ewan persisted with his demands to his father, who put his foot down and refused, and tempers began to flare. It was a very strained relationship. Now, Ewan, caught between his wife and his familial responsibilities, his father, his clan, he threatened to take the land by force, but his father called his bluff on it, which led to an armed confrontation between the father and the son and their respective followers. Now, in like the heyday of the clan system, these kinds of like clan disputes were fought out very similar to like a duel, but in a very gentlemanly way, i.e. with an agreed upon time and place. Things like ambushes and raids, they were part of more like generalized fighting, but like inter-clan disputes, it was solved this way. Now, the day before the fight was due to take place, Ewan was seen riding along on his black charger, so black horse, when he then saw a tiny woman wearing all green, singing a really strange little song that he didn't recognise, as she was washing a bundle of blood-stained clothes in like a small stream by the side of the road. Now again, if you've seen my video on the Banshees, you will know what she is. She was what is considered the Scottish equivalent of the Irish Banshee, known as the Little Washerwoman. And again, like the Banshee, she appeared as an omen of death, as a warning. Now, Ewan also recognised her instantly to be a fairy, and he knew that generally fairy folk, fairy people, had certain abilities that allowed them to sort of look into the future and predict what was going to happen. So he approached her with due respect, tipped his hat, all that stuff, and asked if she would be prepared to tell him the outcome of the upcoming fight. And the response that she gave him was a warning. And said warning was basically that if he found butter at his breakfast table the following morning without having to ask for it, then he would prevail in the fight. However, if there was no butter and he then had to ask for it to be placed there, that misfortune would follow him into the battle. Now, Ewan kind of paid no real mind to it. I think I read that he basically forgot the warning by the end of the day. So come the following morning, the servant did forget to put butter on his table. So he reprimanded the servant, and it was only then, when they then brought the butter to his table, that he remembered what the washerwoman had told him. So, obviously, while Ewan was somewhat wary of the warning that she'd given, he rallied his followers and led them to the field where the battle was going to take place. I've just realised, like, the next main part of this makeup goes majoritively over, like, my mouth and my neck, which is going to make it kind of difficult to talk. So if there's a lot of, like, jump cuts with the makeup, I do apologise. Now, as Ewan was lining up on the field, preparing to face his father and his men, amongst his father's lineup, he recognised his uncle. Now, Ewan's uncle had realised that if Ewan was to be killed during this battle, the lands belonging to his father would be left without an heir, which we could obviously then turn to his advantage. So the battle started, and both sides fought bravely, but in the end, the superior numbers of his father's following started to prevail, and Ewan realised that his forces were starting to fall. So he very recklessly charged into, like, the thickest of the fight. But in doing so, he left himself fully open to the swing of a claymore at, like, shoulder height, wielded by one of his uncle's men, which completely severed his head. Now, whilst poor Ewan had been beheaded, his body was still, like, caught up in the stirrups and saddle of his horse, which was now completely frantic and just bolted from the fight. And it followed the course of this river for, like, miles until it eventually collapsed, just completely exhausted. The tale then goes that his men did eventually find his body and were able to give him, like, a burial, but the precise location of where he was buried is, for the most part, kind of lost through the generations. It was obviously not a particularly well signposted grave, because I think they just buried him kind of at the side of the road where the horse had dropped. But I did read one story of someone who grew up hearing these stories as a boy, and he managed to make contact with one of the few, like, descendants from these clans who the knowledge of where this burial was had been, like, passed down through generations. So he was able to kind of find it and, like, leave little markers and stuff, but that in itself has kind of become, like, its own little sort of localized legend as to the burial site of this man. Now, with regards to his ghost, the belief was that his ghost would haunt the roads of the town and the village and the lands, and that hearing or seeing this particular headless horseman was an omen of death only within the McLean clan, or that the headless horseman would ride out to harvest the souls of the clan, as they were the ones who'd killed him. In that respect, Ewan's story, he's kind of like a cross between a headless horseman and a banshee, because he's, like, tied to one specific family. I actually found reference to another story from, like, a little bit later on, where basically a member of the McLean clan, but specifically on the uncle's side, obviously bearing in mind it was the uncle's men who had killed him, was walking along the road at dusk when he was attacked by the headless horseman. Now, he managed to fend off the ghost with a weapon in one hand, and the other hand he managed to stand his ground by holding on to these young tree saplings. But the struggle went on until sunrise, until the headless horseman had to retire back to the shadows, leaving the man exhausted but safe beside the saplings, which he'd almost torn them out by the root during the struggle. And it was said that after this struggle, those two tree saplings grew almost horizontally along the ground ever since. I tried really hard to find any kind of reference photos of these particular trees, because I read a first-hand account of someone who saw them and, like, grew up around them, because he said that one of them had been taken down where they'd, like, paved new roads, but there was still one tree that was standing horizontally still. If you know of these two horizontal trees, or you have ever seen them or anything like that, please let me know, because I tried so hard to find a photo of them. Now, if you go down from Scotland and into Wales, I couldn't find too much information about them, but there are references and there are said to be tales of headless horsemen and headless horse women throughout Welsh folklore. The one sort of, like, notable example that I did found was about a place called Bryn Hall in a town that I am not even going to try and pronounce this one, because, well, can someone please tell me how that is pronounced? But anyway, according to local legend, Bryn Hall was once haunted by a headless horseman, until one of the hall's servants, like, deciphered a message from the horseman, which identified the location of a buried body, and it would turn out that said body was the body of an illegitimate child fathered by the lord of the hall. Whilst I couldn't find too much about that tale or anything else in sort of Welsh folklore, I did find many a tale in English folklore. Now, as we've seen before, a lot of the differences in tale and story seem to be very much based on sort of localised legends. The one that I saw referenced the most, which I'm going to be honest straight off the bat, I don't think it counts. It's to do with an old legend from the time of King Arthur, or at least from the time set within what's called Arthurian legend, because obviously King Arthur, Camelot, Knights of the Round Table, not a real thing, but they have their own folklore and kind of history with that. But it was to do with a particular legend known as, I'm going to try and say it right, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, the general premise is that it was New Year's Eve in Camelot. King Arthur and his court, they were all celebrating and exchanging gifts. Then a gigantic figure who was completely green and riding a green horse just suddenly appeared. I'm not gonna lie, I did picture the Jolly Green Giant, you know, the sweet corn guy. That I couldn't get that out of my head. But basically, this guy has no armour, he only has an axe. He refuses to fight anyone there on the grounds that they are all too weak, apparently. But he insists that he has instead come for a friendly Christmas game, which is for someone to strike him once, and only once, on the condition that the Green Knight may return the blow in exactly a year and a day, and the axe would belong to whoever accepted that deal. You know, that classic Christmas game. Now, King Arthur is actually about to accept the deal himself when one of his youngest knights, who also happened to be his nephew, I think, steps forward. So the giant, leans forward and basically, presents his neck to Sir Gawain with the axe, who just beheads him in one swing. But the knight does not fall or falter or stumble. He simply stands back up, picks up his severed head, and turns to leave. But before he does leave, he turns around and reminds the knight of their meeting at a place called Green Chapel in a year and a day. Now, that's actually the only part of the story that kind of really has any reference to a headless horseman, because the rest of the story is all to do with chivalry and romance, and it's honestly just kind of dull. The rest of the story is basically, it turns out this big green headless giant was actually the lord of a castle who had been transformed by magic, and the whole thing was an elaborate trick by the sorceress Morgan Le Fay, who was King Arthur's stepsister. And she was basically doing the whole thing as just this really elaborate way of testing King Arthur's knights. Side note, Morgan Le Fay, the super powerful enchantress, she is interesting as hell. I did find a small number of references and stories that the Headless Horseman was included in a list of creatures that supposedly roam Dartmoor, which, if you don't know, is an area in Devon in England known for its moorlands and its national park status. But it is also known for having a really rich history of its own myths and legends. I think there's a general consensus that there's a load of gases that are produced on the moorlands, and basically it makes people hallucinate and see things and that kind of thing. If I remember correctly, The Hound of the Baskervilles, the Sherlock Holmes novel, that was set on the moors in Dartmoor. I could genuinely do an entire episode on just Dartmoor and the history of the legends and myths. I know, for example, it's believed that pixies live there and roam there. But yes, many, many references to a headless horseman who roams the moors. Speaking of moors, I also found a really interesting tale about the headless horseman of the Staffordshire moors, which has had multiple recorded sightings for centuries. Now, with the headless horseman of the Staffordshire moor, some believe that it's an evil spirit that was cast out of heaven and forced to wander the moors, whilst others believe it was a murderer who was beheaded for his crimes and now continually searches for either his head or his executioner. Generally, the origins of the legend have been lost over time, but one of the most accepted sort of early stories of this headless horseman involves a farmer who, while he was returning home, really tired and muddled with beer, saw a rider a little ways ahead of him. So he thought it was his neighbour, so he went up to begin asking him if he could have a lift home, only to realise that it was in fact a headless horseman who grabbed him and just took off. And the farmer was like just trying to cling on for dear life while the rider and the horse just went full pelt, sparks coming off the hooves, hitting the ground. He's flying all over the place. After what felt like an hour, he is eventually basically dumped outside his house, or not far from his home. Now, the farmer after this was like so badly beaten and bruised from this ordeal, this journey, that his wife had to like take him in and put him straight to bed. Obviously, everyone asked, like, what happened? He told them this story, and everyone just kind of laughed at him and said he was a bit of a madman and he was drunk. But then he would then end up dying a few days later from his injuries. Another tale shortly after this involved a woman and her husband, who was also a farmer, who were riding home on their horse along with their dog when a horseman appeared and sort of fell into step with them. Now, the couple's horse started like shaking and getting really agitated, and the dog started howling. Now, the husband looked over and realised that the rider did not have a head, so he tried to sort of motion to his wife about it, but she couldn't see him. Only the husband could see the rider. So, not wanting to scare his wife, he kind of just kept still. Later on that night, he was tossing and turning and he was worrying about it, and he eventually told her what he saw, because it was believed that the horseman was an omen of evil to whoever saw it. So naturally, both the farmer and his wife were really worried. The following day, the horse that they had been riding on died very suddenly, and then shortly after that, their dog got really sick and then also died. These two stories followed quick succession, which rallied the town people to, well, maybe the first guy was actually telling the truth. Okay, I think this part of the illusion is maybe starting to come together now. Now, however many years later, in October of 1880, the legend of the Headless Horseman in this area was written in the local newspaper called the Sentinel. I think it's actually still going, and basically explaining how it was like a common story to tell around the fire during winter, but the highway robbers had used this story to their advantage, you know, wearing sort of ghostly disguises and in some cases working together to play on this legend in order to then rob people. Now, according to this report, they actually called on a church to help sort of lay the demon to rest as such. And I managed to find like an extract from that article which said, and I quote, "Some clergymen were called in to read the prayers that were provided to prevent this goblin from troubling the neighbourhood anymore. But the spirit confessed to these holy men when they forced it into speech that it was one of 4 evil spirits cast out of heaven and condemned to roam over the face of the earth till the crack of doom should release it from its terrestrial wanderings." Now, see, it's interesting because horsemen, 4 evil spirits, crack of doom. Some people have interpreted that to be in reference to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse as written about in the Bible. But obviously the Bible does also reference like fallen angels and spirits being cast out of heaven, not specifically just the horsemen, so it's kind of open to interpretation in that respect. I need to try and do some line work directly over my mouth, which I absolutely will not be able to talk through, so be right back. So I know that was quite a bit of a jump, sort of progress-wise, but I think if I had tried to do any of this detailing whilst talking, it wouldn't have happened. So I'm very sorry for not being able to include any of the details, like the footage of this bit, but I think we're getting there. Now, going back to the Headless Horseman of the Staffordshire Moors, I spoke about obviously the odd stories, the article that was published in the newspaper, and the clergymen that were brought in to try and lay the demon to rest. Now, in the 1920s, a local journalist in the area decided to actually try and track down the horseman. And it wasn't just him either, like a number of members from like a local youth labour group got involved in the hunt as well. And then 1933, 2 separate groups decided they were going to go out and hunt for this horseman. Now, the first group failed for a very simple reason, in that they got the date wrong. So it was believed that the horseman would only appear on May 18th, which was thought to be the day that he had died. But this first group turned up a week early, so nada. Now, the second group, they did turn up on time, but by that point, their plans to go out hunting the horseman had become so well known that it attracted a really big number of locals and strangers and just loads of other people, and the whole spirit chase was described as basically being turned into almost like a carnival. Now, according to another paper that published an article about the night of this spirit chase. Whilst the group saw nothing during that night while they were there, as they were walking home in the early hours of the morning, the sound of horses' hooves could be heard coming in from the mist over the moors. I don't know if you know too much about like moorlands and just moors in general, because they're really creepy. It would not surprise me at all to hear horror stories and tales of like things lurking in the mists on the moors and in the bogs and swamps. It's just, ugh. I don't know, there's something really unnerving about them to me. I mean, I say that when I look like this right now. Another area that I found a lot of references to tales of Headless Horsemen was actually Germany, and some of the oldest associations to the Headless Horseman do in fact come from Germany, with, again, many of the accounts going back centuries. Now, within German folklore, it is very commonly believed that if anyone is guilty of a crime where the punishment is to be beheaded, if they manage to escape that punishment during their lifetime, then they will be condemned after death to wander the earth forever with their head under their arm. Now, there is a tale of a man whose name I will try and pronounce, called Hans Jägenteufel. Now, this dates back to the 1600s, and it begins with a woman who goes out to a wooded area to collect acorns. Now, while she's collecting these acorns, she hears the sound of a hunting horn being blown, and then shortly after that there's a really loud like falling sound, like the sound a tree would make had it been cut down. She gets a bit spooked by this, so she hides her acorns in the grass. She then hears a second horn sound, and she turns around to see a headless rider wearing a grey cloak sitting on the top of a horse. Now, the rider didn't interact with her, he just rode past her. I don't know if she was also hiding in the grass or what, but she eventually sort of regained her courage and composure. She collected her acorns and went off on her way without any further incident. The woman then returns 9 days later to collect more acorns, and this time she hears a voice who asks her, basically, has no one punished you for taking these acorns? To which she replies that no, she hasn't been punished. The foresters are very kind to her because she's poor. She then turns around and sees that it is the horseman, except he's not on his horse this time. He stood there holding his own head, and he basically just reminds her that she would do well to remember to pray to God to ask for forgiveness, as he never did. He then goes on to basically tell her his life story and how he'd been alive about 130 years prior to this, and his father had tried to teach him not to be too hard on people who were less fortunate, people like her who were poor, but he didn't listen to his father and spent his time drinking and just doing all manner of wicked things, and as a result he was now condemned to wander the world as an evil spirit. There's variations in the story, again depending on the location. So in other areas of Germany, specifically around like the Rhineland, rather than using decapitation, the headless horseman in this area supposedly killed people simply by touching them, and they were believed to be revenants who had to wander the earth until they had atoned for their sins. A small side note, I looked up what the word revenant actually means because I often get it confused with other things. Basically, a revenant, in the context of folklore at least, is a spirit or a reanimated corpse that is believed to have been revived from the dead in order to haunt the living. And the word is actually derived from the old French word which means returning. Fun little fact for you there. Now, one way that these spirits could atone for their sins was by doing a good deed for a stranger. But instead of obviously showing their gratitude by shaking hands, which would kill the stranger, they would hold a tree branch between them, and the tree branch would then wither and die instead of the stranger. And I saw a few small references to another legend within Germany of a headless horseman who, rather than seeking out souls and killing them, he would warn the living of impending danger, but then also chase down and punish the wicked. So he was kind of a good guy. Now, despite the headless horseman being a figure from mainly European folklore, a lot of people believe it originated in America and that it is an American myth. Now, this is mainly in thanks to the short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, written in 1820 by Washington Irving. Okay, I've just realised the main bits that I have left to do are centred almost entirely on the middle of my throat, which, again, I will not be able to talk while I'm doing it. So let me go and finish this all off, do the little finishing touches, all that lovely stuff, and then we can come back and finish the story. Is the illusion working? Obviously, I've had to adjust my lighting slightly to try and make the illusion work, and illusions like this never usually work too well on camera because, you know, movement. We'll come back to this in a second. So, Washington Irving, Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So, whilst Washington was born in America, his parents were actually from the UK. His father was from Scotland and his mother was from Cornwall. A lot of people believe that his parents may have known of like the Welsh legends of the Headless Horseman because Wales and Cornwall had very like cultural similarities between the two of them. So some people believe that his parents may have picked it up sort of from there. In Irving's novel, the character known as the Headless Horseman is believed to have been a Hessian soldier who was decapitated by a cannonball during the American War of Independence. Hessian soldiers were German soldiers who served under the British Army for many different battles during the 18th century. Irving actually travelled to Germany in 1821 and became very familiar with like Dutch and German folklore and was fascinated by it. And a lot of people believe that he took inspiration from German folklore to write the story, while others believe that his inspiration came directly from the Irish legend of the Dullahan or just sort of European folklore in general. Now, while most people would refer to Washington Irving and Sleepy Hollow when talking about the Headless Horseman in America, there is another fairly well-known legend that comes from southern Texas, and it's all stories about a figure known as El Muerto that have circulated since like the mid-1800s. So, El Muerto, which is a Spanish term that translates as the dead one, and not to be confused with the luchador wrestler from the Marvel universe, which I didn't know about, so that was an interesting Google search. So it's said to be a headless horseman whose head dangles from the saddle of the horse, and the horse is then said to produce lightning when its hooves hit the ground. There is some belief that this particular iteration of the Headless Horseman is based on yet another legend in which a man was caught stealing horses and the punishment was that he was decapitated. His executioners decided they wanted to make an example of him, so they attached his headless body to a wild horse, attaching it to the saddle, and they attached his head to the pommel of the saddle and let the horse run off, which reminds me a little bit of the tale from Scotland of Ewan, whose horse carried on riding with his body, although this one is, I'd say, somewhat more disturbing. Now, if you go over to Japan, there's actually an urban legend known as the Headless Rider, which is a motorbike rider without a head. Unlike the European Headless Horseman, this is a fairly modern, fairly new myth. It's an urban legend, and the rumours only really started gaining any traction around Japan after the release of a film called Stone in 1974 in Australia that was then released in Japan in 1981. Now, this film contained a scene in which a rider's head was cut off by a wire stretched across the road, and it's said that this story then spread in connection with the rumours of motorbike accidents that were happening in various parts of the country. The legend itself is said to have originated from an actual accident in which someone who apparently was annoyed with a biker gang is said to have stretched rope across the road as an obstruction, which then caused the riders to crash. There are lots of other theories surrounding this original accident, with many people believing that there was genuinely some kind of like accidental fatal motorbike crash at some point, but it was then passed on with this sort of very exaggerated story. Other people take a slightly more logical approach and believe that the legend and the story kind of originated from motorcyclists who were wearing dark full face helmets on a dark road at night, who was then mistakenly identified as a headless rider. Apparently it's a thing in Japan that some motorbike riders will deliberately wear full-face, dark visor helmets with specialised, like, reduced light reflection on them in order to sort of play up to that legend. Now, the legend itself goes that it was a piano wire stretched across the road, causing a motorcyclist to be decapitated when he collided with it at high speed. However, as we've seen in a number of stories, the bike remained upright with the headless rider still on it. Following this, the rider then became a ghost who would ride down that same road every single night or on the anniversary of their death, searching for their murderer and their missing head. One final side note before we finish everything off: I did find reference to a story from Brazilian folklore regarding something known as the headless mule. Now, the headless part, I think, is the only connection. But I found it really, 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 really fascinating, and I wanted to mention it. The legend of the headless mule is to do with a woman who was cursed to transform into a fire-spewing headless mule as punishment for her sins. I ended up reading loads about it, and I was going to go into a bit more detail, but it is a completely separate thing, and to be honest, I'd rather do its own episode because it's really, really fascinating. Some of the imagery for it is like, it's the body of a mule, and then instead of a head, it's just fire. But yes, I got very, very sidetracked by that story, but I did make it back to my notes on the Headless Horseman in the end, which is my so well written way of circling to the end. Man, I gotta start planning this stuff better. The Dullahan specifically is a hell of a lot more like evil than I realised, whereas the other iterations of the Headless Horseman in different cultures kind of seems to vary on whether it's evil or not. And I find it interesting that different cultures, it's like a different type of creature, because obviously in Ireland it's unseelie, fairy, fey creature, whereas almost everywhere else it's a ghost. As always, I'm going to ask, have you guys ever had any experiences or know of anyone who has experienced, seen, witnessed, or heard about something to do with a Headless Horseman? And no, the one that goes up and down at Disneyland does not count. Let me know what you guys think of the stories and the legends and the different sort of iterations. If there's anything I've missed, obviously again, let me know. What do we think of the look? This was a challenge for me. I can't lie. I think generally I'm happy with it. The mouth illusion is really, really tricky to do, and I've never done a neck illusion like that before either, so it's been a learning curve at least. But in case you couldn't tell, I was going for the Dullahan iteration with the big grin in the eyes and the ugh. If I sit like that and squint, then it works. Let me know what you guys think of the Headless Horseman and the Dullahan. Let me know what you think of the look. Let me know who or what else you want me to cover in any future videos. Otherwise, I hope you all have a fabulous day. I don't think I have any other closing notes, or if I have, I've forgotten them. So I hope you are all having a wonderfully spooky October, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye. We're leaning again less into the monster side of things and much more into the mythology and kind of a bit of like superstition, because as you would have probably seen from the thumbnail, today we are looking at the mythology and legend and lore surrounding black cats. Now obviously black cats are real, they are a thing, but obviously during my research into Halloween for ideas for looks, and obviously the first video that I did about Halloween itself, there was loads of like iconography and various things that were associated with the holiday and the spooky season. Obviously one of which is the black cat. It's kind of synonymous with it, especially in relation to like witches and witchcraft. They're very, very closely associated. And it kind of got me thinking about like where that association came from. During my research, I also discovered that today is National Black Cat Day. So, not to be confused with National Black Cat Appreciation Day, which is August 17th. No, today is National Black Cat Day. I thought it would be quite fitting to kind of look into this whole mythology aspect and unearth why there are these like superstitions and stuff associated with black cats. And, you know, I can kind of semi-promote National Black Cat Day while I'm doing it, because if you don't know, National Black Cat Day is basically a day to try and dispel all of the negative myths and superstitions that tend to follow black cats, i.e. the idea that they're unlucky or associated with witches and witchcraft and like all that kind of crap. And it's a way of trying to promote the adoption of black cats from shelters and things like that, because unfortunately not that long ago, and for many, many places, black cats were usually the last to be adopted from shelters and pet shops and that kind of thing. A, because of all these weird superstitions and theories and myths surrounding them. The second reason was because they apparently don't photograph as well as other coloured cats, which, if you're picking an animal for a pet based on how well you can take a photograph of them, gonna be honest, don't think you should be getting a pet. Before I get too sidetracked and waffle on for too much longer, let me go and get myself prepped, and then we can start. I'm aware that my eyes are currently 2 different colours right now because of the contacts. It's because I have a different contact to put in this eye that I cannot see out of, so I'm going to change that one out at the end. So black cats. I personally absolutely adore black cats. I have owned black cats in the past. I even have like a tiny little tattoo of a black cat in honour of one of those black cats that I owned. Yeah, I appreciate everyone has personal preferences with pets and things like that, blah blah blah. But why would you not want like a tiny little panther running around your house? But that's beside the point. Now, black cats do have a lot of superstition attached to them. In particular, the idea of them being bad luck, whether it's owning one, seeing one, crossing paths with one. It's a very common superstition, and a very, very old one as well. Unfortunately, there is a real-life impact in that, generally speaking, black cats are the last to be adopted from shelters. So, I started looking into sort of where this superstition in particular came from, because especially in some cultures, black cats are the opposite, and that they're actually considered good luck, and they're often a sign of wealth and prosperity. Now, the origins of black cats especially being seen as like bad omens seems to stem from sometime during the Middle Ages, or Medieval Ages, whichever one you want to call it. Because up until that point, black cats, and just cats in general, were often seen as a good sign, to the extent that they were worshipped in places like ancient Egypt. Now, the Egyptians worshipped cats for a number of different reasons, and they often honoured them with gold and jewels and good food, special burials, that kind of thing, but black cats in particular were seen as a sign of good luck. It was fairly common practice in ancient Egypt for basically every household to have a pet cat. They were incredibly practical and very useful to have around. Generally speaking, they could look after themselves, and they were very skilled hunters, which obviously helped get rid of pests. In particular, they were praised for their ability to get rid of things like venomous snakes. So they were often seen as like protectors and guardians, as well as very fierce predators, and it was believed that they offered protection to the home from sort of evil spirits as well. And this was in part due to the fact that the ancient Egyptians believed that cats possessed sort of divine energy. They didn't see cats as gods, but believed that the gods could inhabit cats, which is why a lot of deities have like cat-like features to them. But it's also the reason why they were honoured with gifts and jewels and good meals and special burials. It was a way of honouring this energy, and served as a reminder for the power of these gods. There's a collection of ancient funeral texts from ancient Egypt that has been sort of collectively given the name the Book of the Dead, and it consisted of a number of like magic and spells that were used to assist a dead person's journey to the underworld and the afterlife, and it was compiled by like various priests and written over like the course of about 1,000 years. Now, this book indicated that cats were actually a representative of the ancient Egyptian deity of the sun, Ra, who is in some cases arguably like one of the most important gods within ancient Egyptian mythology. And this association of cats with this god indicated that cats had a sort of protective function within Egyptian mythology and Egyptian beliefs. Alongside this, and possibly another reason why cats were sort of revered so much and associated with this particular solar deity, is obviously Egyptians worshipped a lot to do with the sun. The sun deity was the most important. And obviously cats are known for basking in sunlight and sunspots. And oftentimes, if you ever see a cat lying in the sunlight, obviously the colour of their fur can like shift and change, especially black cats. If you see black cats in sunlight, they often take on a kind of like almost a red hue to them, which obviously was a very important colour to the Egyptians because of the association with the sun. And obviously Egyptians had a number of deities that had cat-like features, or just as far as cat heads. Quick disclaimer, because I forgot to mention it at the beginning again. Obviously looking at other cultures, other languages, especially ancient cultures, there's a lot of really tricky words and names, so I will try my best to get the pronunciations right, but I'm just going to apologise in advance for any that I get wrong. As always, please do feel free to let me know how they should actually be pronounced if I do get them wrong. I found reference to a number of deities that had cat-like heads, one of which was the goddess Maftet, who was the goddess of justice, or like legal justice. Some people believe she was the goddess of like capital punishment, but she protected the sun god Ra from venomous snakes and scorpions, and she wore the skin of a cheetah as her head. Another one that I saw was the goddess Sekhmet, who was a warrior goddess, as well as actually being the daughter of the sun god Ra. She was also considered to be the goddess of medicine as well, so I found that a lot of Egyptian... It's the same with Greece, actually. A lot of, like, ancient deities had, like, multiple things that they were gods or goddesses of. I found some reference that she was said to be quite a cruel and sort of vengeful goddess who could breathe fire and cause plagues, but she was depicted with the head of a lioness. Now, the goddess most commonly associated with cats specifically is the goddess Bastet. Now, she was actually often associated with Sekhmet as well. In some instances, they were characterised as basically being like two aspects of the same goddess, just under two slightly different titles, with Sekhmet being the fierce, protective warrior with the lioness's head, and Bastet later being depicted with the head of a black cat, representing the more sort of gentle side. Because although Bastet was still a fierce warrior in her own right, she was known for being the goddess of protection from illness and evil spirits, and through the association with the cats, and obviously cats having a fairly high fertility rate, she was also known as the goddess of pregnancy and childbirth. Now, alongside their association with, like, the gods and divine energy, cats were also very often depicted in art and fashion and, like, home decor throughout ancient Egypt. And cats were treated with so much respect that it was forbidden to kill a cat. And anyone who did, even if it was an accident, they were sentenced to death. And that respect for the cat continued after they died as well. They were mummified, given very elaborate burials, often buried with their owners or their families, and apparently people would shave off their eyebrows as a sign of mourning when their cat died. So obviously back then, the ancient Egyptians associated cats with gods and deities and divine energy, whereas nowadays they're more often associated with witches and witchcraft. So I started trying to follow this up to work out why, when, and sort of how this shift occurred, which then led me to ancient Greece. Again. So characters from ancient Greece in particular included Artemis, who was the goddess of the hunt, but she was also considered the goddess of the wilderness, wild animals, nature, childbirth, the moon, and forests. I'm pretty sure there was a few other things that she was associated with as well, but those were like the main 6 or 7. Now, Artemis was actually very often linked with the Egyptian goddess Bastet because she had the ability to transform herself into any animal, and there was one particular instance when she transformed herself into a cat. Now, the instance that she transformed herself into a cat was during the war between Typhon and the gods. If you saw my video on Medusa, you will know that Typhon was this just big, bad, sea monster-y creature, but like the biggest and the baddest of all big bad things within ancient Greece. So he went to war with the gods, the Olympians, under Zeus's rule, and whilst Artemis fought in the battle alongside many of the other Olympians, Zeus ordered all of them to like flee to Egypt because basically he was like, yeah, we've got no chance against this thing right now. So all of the Olympians turned themselves into animals in order to escape, and Artemis very famously turned herself into a cat. Now, Artemis is also very closely linked with the goddess Hecate, I believe it's pronounced, who was considered the goddess of crossroads, magic, spells, witchcraft, and again, the moon. Now, similar to Bastet and Sekhmet, there are some theories that Artemis and Hecate are two aspects of the same goddess. And it was after Artemis was like adopted into the Olympian pantheon, she would have become more associated with things like purity and maidenhood, because Artemis was known as one of the virgin goddesses. So her originally like slightly darker associations with things like magic and the night would have been worshipped separately under the title of Hecate. I found quite a few other myths regarding these two particular goddesses, one of which was that Artemis saved someone called Iphigenia, who I believe was Agamemnon's daughter. But basically Artemis saved her from being sacrificed and then transformed her into Hecate. But there is some debate on whether Hecate existed before this, and whether or not Iphigenia becomes Hecate or becomes part of Hecate if she already existed, if that makes sense. Now, the whole reason for going down this little tangent is that Hecate was said to have kept a black cat as a pet and a familiar who would assist her with spells and witchcraft and magic, which forms a lot of the origins for black cats being associated with witchcraft. Or at least some people believe that's where a lot of the origins for the black cat witchcraft thing came from. Because I obviously looked into it a lot, and the more I looked into it, I found a lot of very conflicting information on it. Because Hecate was actually often depicted and very closely associated with a female dog rather than a cat. And this was most likely due to the dog's connection to birth and fertility. And in some cases, it was believed that this dog was her familiar. And in fact, in some versions, the dog itself even has like an origin story where it was originally the Trojan queen, Hecuba, who leapt into the sea after the fall of Troy, and then Hecate transformed her. But in relation to the cat familiar, I found a lot of references to a tale of someone called Galinthius. You're going to have to bear with me on this because I'm about to throw a whole lot of names and it's about to get real confusing, but just try and stick with me. Galinthius was believed to be sort of a maiden and companion to Alcmene, who went on to become the mother of Heracles, who was fathered by Zeus. So the story goes that as Alcmene was in labour with Heracles, there were 3 sisters who were known as the MWAH. Basically, they were like the personification of destiny. They were sometimes referred to as like the Fates. And there were also the Aletheia, who were known as like the birth goddesses. Now, between these 3 sisters of fate and destiny and the birth goddesses, they prevented Alcmene from giving birth, keeping her in labour, or what was referred to as birth pangs. Now, they did this as a favour to Hera, who was Zeus's wife. Oh no, sorry, Zeus's sister wife, because Greek mythology. And also because Greek mythology, there seems to be a recurring theme of women being punished and cursed and whatever for the behaviour of men. Look at the case of Medusa. She was punished because Poseidon forced himself on her, and here, Hera decided to keep Alcmene in the middle of labour because Zeus couldn't keep it in his pants. Which, let's face it, you married to Zeus, like, it's a very known fact that the dude banned, like, the entirety of ancient Greek civilization at this point. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Now, Galinthius was worried that being kept in this, like, prolonged state of labour would just send Alcmene mad, which, fair. Now, the 3 sisters and the birth goddesses during this whole thing had remained seated with their arms firmly crossed, preventing Alcmene from progressing through her labour. Now, Galinthius ran up to them and basically announced that as part of Zeus's will, Alcmene had given birth to a baby boy, which kind of rendered their interference as null and void. This then led to the 3 sisters of fate letting go of their arms, at which point Alcmene's labour then ended and Heracles was born. Now, the 3 fate sisters and the birth goddesses were particularly angry about this, because they, as gods, had been deceived by Galinthius, who was immortal. So they then proceeded to transform Galinthius into a black cat in appearance as punishment. Now, Hecate felt sorry for Galinthius for having her appearance changed like this, so she ended up appointing her as like a sacred servant to herself, to then assist her with magic and spell work, that kind of thing. There are some variations on this particular tale that state Galinthius was actually like a maiden and servant to Hera herself, who then cursed Galinthius directly for interfering with her interference of Heracles' birth. Now, this would, in theory, then make perfect sense as to why black cats would be associated with witchcraft years down the line, especially as in this case the black cat was only a black cat in appearance, so could still kind of communicate and think like the person they were beforehand, which also links to the idea of like the black cat familiar and the concept of witches being able to transform into black cats. So it all links up, except that it doesn't. Because the more I looked into it, the more I struggled to find any kind of official historical records of this black cat story, specifically in relation to it being a black cat that Galinthius was transformed into. In every other reference and iteration that I found, she was transformed into a polecat, or a weasel basically, as a reflection of her deceitfulness. There was an additional detail of her transformation into this weaselly polecat thing that the Sisters of Fate very specifically included, which I will apologise for in advance, because while she is a polecat in appearance, she is still Galanthea's, but they transformed her in such a way that she was forced to mate as this animal, but in a really awful way, and not at all how nature intended for a weasel or polecat to mate. It was said that in order for her to mate as this animal, she had to be mounted in the ear, and she then basically gave birth by throwing up her young, which, grim. I mean, I guess that's what you get for pissing off several different, very powerful gods. So based on this, it's much more accurate to say that weasels and polecats were more commonly associated with Hecate rather than cats. I wonder if gradually over time people just kind of stopped understanding what a polecat was and dropped the pole and just referred to it as cat, and then that's where it came from. Because I'll be honest, I had to look up what a polecat was because I didn't know. Now, whilst in that particular story, Hecate takes pity on someone who gets transformed into a polecat, there is yet another tale in which Hecate herself transforms someone into a polecat. Now, in this case, it's in reference to a minor character in Greek mythology known as Gale, who was a very skilled witch who dealt in like herbs and potions. However, she was described as being extremely lascivious, which is basically an unnecessarily complicated word for like lusty or horny or lewd. And she was said to have abnormal sexual desires. However, most of those were not described in any kind of detail, so I don't know what said abnormal desires were. Now, I'm not one to kink shame, but apparently her desires were abnormal enough that she then incurred the wrath of Hecate, who transformed her into a polecat. Now, in the stories that I read, polecat and weasel were like interchangeable, and apparently weasels especially were actually thought to have a certain level of like magical potency in ancient Greece, but not necessarily like the beneficial kind, but it's another reason that they are often associated with Hecate. So if the Greek mythology of witches and black cats is actually not that accurate, where did the association come from? And for that, we have to fast forward to Europe in the Middle Ages. I know the majority of this side of my face looks boring as hell right now compared to some of the other looks that I've done, and it's honestly giving me very 2016 vibes. Please bear with me because I'm hoping this will all kind of tie together at the end. But yes, Europe, Middle Ages. Up until sort of the 13th century, cats were very highly valued for a lot of the same like practical reasons that they were valued in ancient Egypt, i.e. hunting skills and sort of natural pest control. They were kept to protect like stores of grain from rats and mice, and they were the only animals that were allowed inside monasteries for the same reason, and a lot of religious texts and manuscripts feature cats chasing or eating mice. They were actually so highly valued for this that an adult cat would actually fetch the same price as a fully grown sheep, a goat, or an untrained house dog, and a kitten was given the same value as like a piglet or a lamb. Now, written records of cats being linked to like the occult, and especially black cats, date as far back as the 13th century, and for that we can thank Pope Gregory IX, who in 1233 issued an official church document that declared all cats needed to be killed, and that black cats especially were an incarnation of Satan. Now, this particular declaration had incredibly far-reaching effect, and it essentially marked the beginning of the Inquisition and the church-backed witch hunts, which were apparently initially designed in order to try and stop the growing cults of Luciferians in Germany, but then it quickly spread across Europe. Now, in this particular context as well, witches were believed to be pre-Christian pagan practitioners, and whilst the early church did sort of coexist with witches in Europe for a set amount of time, similar to what happened with the pagan festival of Samhain. As the church grew in sort of popularity and gained power, they saw witches as their direct competition in gaining like the hearts and minds and beliefs of the people, which is when the church then began hunting and torturing, persecuting and killing witches in vast numbers. This is kind of giving Batman right now. Or Catman. I will see myself up. Now, witches, especially with their association with pagans and pagan practices, were known for honouring the natural world, having a deep respect for plants and animals and wildlife, which led to any kind of affection between humans and animals being sort of marked by the church as like diabolical and devilish. So very quickly, the little old lady who lived with a bunch of cats soon became a suspected threat to the church. Now, as well as witches and devils, the other aspects of cats in particular that made them a target for the church was that the early church saw them as a threat and feared them because of their behaviour and their mannerisms. Think of a cat, a typical cat. Generally speaking, they are very independent, they're self-sufficient, and, you know, in some cases they're kind of aloof almost. They don't necessarily respect authority, and in some instances they could be seen as having actually an outright disrespect for authority. I mean, have you tried telling a cat what to do? Like, they don't listen. Their independence and self-sufficiency was part of what they were celebrated for in places like ancient Egypt. However, these kinds of traits were similar to the traits of women who were accused of being witches. And as far as the church were concerned, neither an independent woman nor an independent animal would be tolerated. Another reason that black cats in particular became so heavily associated with witches and witchcraft was for a much more logical and practical reason. A lot of the women who were accused of witchcraft did have cats as pets, and a lot of them did have black cats as pets for the practical reason that black cats made better hunters because they hunt at night and it's harder to see a black cat at night. They were more successful in hunting mice and rodents and pests, so that was why they were more often kept. On that note though, there was a very unexpected and rather unfortunate side effect of Pope Gregory's declaration, because where he basically decreed that not only black cats but all cats should be killed, it did mean that the number of cats that were around did significantly decrease. Now, with fewer cats around, who were revered and kept for their rodent hunting abilities, there was a huge increase in the rat population. And what were rats known for carrying during the Middle Ages? The Black Plague. You ordered everyone to kill the rat catchers, and now there's loads of rats. Insert shocked Pikachu face. The spread of the Black Plague across Europe was estimated to have killed around 50 million people, which was roughly 60% of Europe's population at that time. And obviously a lot of people know about the whole, they thought it was in the air, so they set bonfires, they didn't realise it was coming from the rats thing. I knew that, I remember learning about that at school. But I didn't know that it was basically because there was a shortage of cats because of the church that led to an increase in rats that then contributed to the spread of the plague. And it's believed that had Pope Gregory not issued that decree, then the cats would have significantly reduced the numbers and millions of lives could have been saved. Now, going back to the whole association with witches and the witch hunt and the trials, that kind of thing, there was a book published in 1584 called Beware the Cat, which was one of the first to allude to the idea of a cat having 9 lives, which, according to this book, was the number of times a witch could take on the form of a cat. And the idea of them being able to transform into a cat in the first place is, again, most likely from the fact that a lot of the women who were accused of being a witch had cats as pets. Another possible origin for the concept of cats having 9 lives and the witches transforming into cats comes from Celtic mythology. It's basically the same concept, but the book was the first written sort of confirmation of this idea. So going into Celtic mythology, we are once again going back to Ireland and Scotland, but more predominantly in Scotland rather than Ireland this time. The Irish and the Celts, just that whole area, they had some crazy mythology, man. But anyway, within the Scottish Highlands particularly, there is a creature known as the Ketchie. Now, this was considered a fairy creature, and it resembled a large black cat with like a white spot on its chest. Now, the legends of this creature have that it haunts the Scottish Highlands, and whilst it is considered a fairy creature, there are some sort of common localised folklore stories that suggest the Ketchie is actually a witch that could transform into a cat 9 times, but if she chose to go back into a cat for that 9th time, she would then remain a cat for the rest of her life. Now, this mythology was really interesting because the people of the Scottish Highlands did not trust this cat, or this cat spirit or witch, whichever one it is, because it was apparently believed that this being, this creature, could steal a person's soul before it was claimed by the gods once they died, and they did so by passing over a body before it was buried. And they believed this and distrusted this creature so much that people would keep watch night and day in what was known as late wakes in order to keep the spirit away from the body before it was buried. And there were loads of methods of distraction that were used, and this included things like games and leaping around, wrestling, catnip, music, riddles, basically anything to keep the Ketchie away from the body, or at least away from the room that the body was in. And they also made sure that there was no fires near where the body lay, because it was said that the Ketchie was attracted to the warmth. Which is fair, because cats do like warmth. Now, the Ketchie was also linked to the pagan festival of Samhain, and it was a practice to leave a saucer of milk outside your house for the Ketchie to drink. The belief being that any household who did this, the Ketchie would bless them. However, any household who did not leave out a saucer of milk, the Ketchie would then curse that household to have all of their cows' udders dry up. The actual legend of this creature may have been inspired by the Scottish wildcat, especially the Kellas cat, which is like a hybrid between a Scottish wildcat and a domestic cat. And the Kellas cat in particular was genuinely believed to be a mythological creature up until 1984, when a gamekeeper managed to kill one in like a snare and presented it. When they reported that they'd killed this creature, suddenly all these farmers and gamekeepers came forward saying that they'd been hunting these big black cats in the Scottish Highlands for years. Fun, slightly more light-hearted little side note, there's a British folk tale called The King of the Cats, which I kind of love. Basically, a man comes home to his wife and his cat, who is called Old Tom, and he tells them that he saw 9 black cats with a little white spot on their chest carrying a coffin with a crown on it. And one of the cats turned to him and told him to tell Tom Tildrum that Tim Toldrum is dead. The cat, Old Tom, then exclaims, "What? Old Tim is dead? Then I'm the king of the cats," before climbing up the chimney and never being seen again. I don't know what it is about that tale that just... it's really dumb. It makes me smile quite a lot, I can't lie. Now again, going back to the whole Middle Ages witch hunt thing, the first widely documented witch trial in Britain was in 1566 in the Essex area, and it was against 4 women: Laura Winchester, Elizabeth Francis, Agnes Waterhouse, and her daughter Joan. Now, it was said that Elizabeth confessed to being taught witchcraft by her grandmother when she was 12 years old, and her grandmother actually gave her a cat who was called Sathan, and it was said that she had given her blood to the devil in the form of this cat, which she kept in a little basket and fed and looked after. She apparently confessed to using the cat as a kind of vessel to work some of her simple but harmful magic, and she then rewarded it with chickens and droplets of her own blood. Along this note, Sathan was apparently responsible for the death of a man who had gotten Elizabeth pregnant but then refused to marry her. Now, 15 years later, this cat, Sathan, was passed on to Elizabeth's sister, Agnes, where he apparently continued on his evil rampage, causing the death of lots of geese and cows and other livestock. Now, there were numerous trials for Elizabeth and her family. If I remember correctly, Elizabeth was found not guilty because she basically confessed and kind of threw these old women under the bus. Agnes was sentenced and then executed. Joan, her daughter, was found not guilty. I didn't really see anything about what happened to Laura Winchester or how she was kind of related to all of them, so if you know anything about that, please let me know, because I'm really curious. But obviously during these trials, the cat, Sathan, was basically used as like a bit of a scapegoat for various misfortunes and deaths that happen within the area. Now, alongside being used as the scapegoat for all these problems and misfortunes, sensationalized stories about the whole trial began to spread throughout Britain, which reinforced this negative reputation that cats had started to gain, thanks to the church, and this idea of an evil familiar or like a spirit in the form of an animal. And given this association, it's believed that this is where the superstition developed surrounding it being bad luck if a black cat crosses your path. I want to try and add some like fur texture to this. The method that I'm thinking of using may just completely ruin the whole thing. Okay, I ended up doing that completely off camera, so I do apologise. I think I've managed to add a bit more texture and like depth to it, but it's too late for me to go back on it now anyway, so I'm going back to the idea of black cats being bad luck if you cross paths with them. So the fear that was being generated by the church, along with the sensationalized stories that were coming from witch hunts and witch trials, it led to the fear that a black cat crossing your path could very well be on a mission for a witch, or it could even be the devil in disguise. And obviously crossing paths with the devil was not really something you wanted to do. So black cats started becoming this bad omen. The idea continued and developed a lot, to the extent that peasants believed crossing paths with a black cat may very well have been a witch's familiar who had been sent in order to hurt them. So as a result, they may have then hurried off to the nearest church that they could find, and then paid the priest to bless them and rid them of any curses that the cat might have put on them. And obviously with this now developing into a potential source of income for the church, it was very likely that these fears were then encouraged and reinforced by them. Now, whilst it seems to have originated in Europe, the fear of black cats in particular did eventually make its way across the Atlantic, most likely thanks to the Puritan colonists in the 1600s, which is partly why the superstition of a black cat is so negative in America, whereas in other countries it's actually the opposite. Now, despite all of the witch trials, in England black cats are said to bring joy and prosperity to newlyweds, symbolising a long and happy marriage, and was said to actually make quite a fortuitous wedding gift. There was an article in 1927 about a bride-to-be who saw a black cat sitting on the steps of the church the morning of her wedding. She then saw another one at the door to the hotel, the hall, and the reception, just constantly seeing black cats throughout the entirety of her wedding day. Fun little side story actually, I went to a wedding years ago, and it was at this really big, very private venue that was kind of in the middle of nowhere, didn't really have neighbours or anything like that, and whilst we were there, I found a cat, this little black and white cat, really, really cute, lovely, who then just stayed with me for the entire night. There's photos of me sitting just with this cat on my lap for most of the evening. Now, the venue did not have a cat, and they didn't have any neighbours nearby who had a cat. The hotel staff had never seen the cat before, and it was a very odd thing for them, but yeah, I spent the entire wedding with a cat. On a nice note with that though, the couple are still happily married and they have 2 children now. Black cats are actually quite often seen as good omens in the eyes of sailors and fishermen as well, and the wives of English fishermen often kept black cats in their homes as tokens of luck to ensure their husbands would return safely from sea. And similarly, sailors would often aim to try and have a black cat on board as a ship's cat for good fortune and good weather while they were sailing, as well as a way of warding off evil spirits and offering protection. This belief in particular actually became so popular that the price of black cats absolutely skyrocketed. Within the folklore of France, there's a creature known as the Matagot, or Mandagot, that takes the form of an animal, usually a black cat. And an aspect of this folklore is known as the magician cat, And a certain aspect of this folklore is known as the magician cat, which is said to bring wealth to the home if it's well fed. Traditionally, you would lure a wealth-bringing Matagot back to your home by using like a fresh, plump chicken was the preferred method. You would then have to carry it home without looking back. Then, as long as the cat is given a warm bed to sleep in and the first bite of every meal and drink, it would then repay the owner with a single gold coin every morning. I never realised this, but Masagots are actually even included within the Harry Potter universe, and they were used by the French Ministry of Magic for various like handiwork and security. I think it was part of the like Fantastic Beasts side aspect of Harry Potter. I do not remember them being referenced in like the films or the books at all, so I don't know where they came into it, but they're in there. Now, around the same time as the witch hunts in Europe, if you went over to the east, to Japan, during what was known as the Edo period, there were some superstitions that black cats could cure tuberculosis. The iconic fortune cat, known as the Maneki Neko, I think it's pronounced, obviously brings good luck and sort of life successes, but black fortune cats are also believed to ward off demons and evil spirits and actually stalkers as well. There's also a similar belief to the English one about black cats and like happy marriages, in that a single woman in Japan can attract a number of male suitors, and not just any, but like the fine, attractive kind, if she keeps a black cat. So basically the whole superstition surrounding black cats and whether they're good luck or bad luck just depends entirely on where you go and which law you choose to follow. Now, I think I may have actually timed this perfectly because I only have like the little finishing touches left to do and I'm basically done with my stories. So let me just go finish this off real quick and then we can round it all off. I think this is the most comically oversized hat I could have possibly found for this. I'm not gonna lie, the netting is kind of growing on me though. Having the hat at a jaunty angle along with the veil, I'm feeling very sassy right now. I don't have like a particularly clever way of rounding it all off this week, but I will just take a second to advocate for black cats because it is National Black Cat Day. I adore black cats, and I know superstitions can be quite a personal thing, and some of them can be very obscure, very specific as well. But the ones about black cats, it's just, it's so stupid. And the fact that there is like the real life impact still to this day that black cats are not adopted or returned or in some cases mistreated, specifically for these like 100-year-old theories and stories that were fear-mongered by other groups of people. I don't know, if I could adopt like all the black cats, I would. Also, I will just say, I know obviously the whole point of this particular day is to try and dispel the rumours and the myths and the associations with witches and witchcraft and that kind of thing. The look that I've chosen to do is very much not reinforcing, but playing on that association. But I wanted to look into and kind of tell the story of how this whole thing started. Let me know what you guys think. If you know anything else to do with like superstitions around black cats or any particular mythology that is linked to cats or black cats, let me know, because I would genuinely be really interested to see it. The start of this research was kind of all over the place, if I'm honest. If you do have a black cat, please let me know their names. What do we think of the mythology regarding black cats and their association with witches and witchcraft and all things bad luck, but also good luck? Let me know what you think of the look as well. Thank you so much for joining me for this week and for your just kind of general support throughout October. Self-promo moment for a second, but make sure you are subscribed, notifications on, all that stuff, just so that you don't miss any of the uploads. But other than that, I hope you all have a fabulous day. I appreciate you, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.